It's the first house I've ever bought. Many of my friends consider it a great achievement for someone in their late 20s, but I suspect it'll be the last house I ever buy. There was something not right about it. I should have trusted my gut when I saw that strange little space in the basement. It wasn't big enough to be considered a room. It was the wrong height to be a closet of any kind. Perhaps it held some sort of heating unit from the past. The house was mostly new. I say mostly because it was built over the foundation of an older house, so that strange space was probably part of the other building. Despite it being empty, it felt oddly full. Standing close to it made me feel how I imagine a small dog might feel, picking up the territory marked by a wolf. But the price was good, so I ignored my instincts. The agent told me the owner had suddenly received a new job opportunity across town and did not want to spend 3 hours driving to and fro from work every day. They were looking to sell fast, and if I could get past the minor fix-ups the property required, this was a steal. It was in an up-and-coming property area with several schools and shopping malls planned to be built within a 15-minute drive. How could I pass up the opportunity? I told myself that I could probably just seal up the creepy basement as I got my finances together. Part of me knew that I was never going to get around to that. Most likely I'd just sit up here and never enter the basement. I've survived here for a year and 6 months, 12 days, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. No, I can't just leave. One of them appears to have attached itself to me, and I'm scared that if I move, it'll follow me. Then I'll have to set up a new routine to keep it at bay. Failing that, well, I have no idea what it does when it catches up. I have no intention of finding out. Yes, I'll admit I have one of those personality types where I leave things until the last minute. But I have made it this far in life, so leave me alone, okay? It began, as many things do, with knocking in the walls. I thought it was just creaks of wood in the house settling. What else could it be, right? That was until my friend came over to stay one night. I'm an introvert, so holding a house party was an unattractive prospect, but my extrovert adopter, Vivian, had been very excited for my first house purchase, and having disappointed her regarding the lack of a house party, I made her the consolation prize of being my first guest to sleep over. I'd only stayed in the house for a couple of weeks. A lot of things were still in boxes, and I had not shopped for much furniture. After a simple dinner, we made ourselves cozy with sleeping bags, nachos, soft drinks, and my brand new television. We were in the middle of a good conversation when the knocking came. V sat up, with her eyes scanning the ceiling as if looking for the source. I stared at her quizzically, but suddenly she asked aloud, "Is anyone there?" We stayed silent, just as I was about to say something. Several knocks sounded. V broke into a half grin. "What are you doing?" I asked her. "Didn't you notice? That rapping sound," she said, eyes still scanning the ceiling. "Yeah, I've heard it since I moved in, just the house settling." "Sounds like it's been trying to participate in our conversation," V put in. I hadn't noticed the knocking when we were talking for the last 3 hours, but then the odd knocks had become somewhat background noise to me. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I did not do well with spooky things. The last horror movie I'd watched had kept me awake for 3 weeks, and I swore to never do that again. Can we maybe not test this?" I squeaked, but I could see that V had that look in her eye, and I'd never successfully dissuaded her from doing anything. "1 knock for yes, 2 for no," she persisted, calling out loudly to the ceiling. Then, leaning over to me, completely ignorant of my wide-eyed discomfort, she whispered, "I watched this in a documentary once. A family communicated with a spirit in their house this way." What happened to the family?" I asked, not sure if I wanted to know. A sharp rap from the ceiling was my reply. No, I announced, standing up. "We are leaving this instant." I was preparing to get into a pair of jeans, grab my keys, and go somewhere, anywhere but here. Late hour be damned. V snorted and laughed at me. Don't be silly. Okay. We don't have to continue. You haven't had any bad experiences here for the past couple of weeks, right? No, I said, relieved she was going to stop whatever the heck was going on. It was true. I hadn't actually gotten the creeps or had any nightmares since moving in. Then it's just some creaking, right? Even if it is something, she said, and I winced at the thought. It seems like it's friendly. Okay, but any further knocking or seeking of responses, and we're going to stay over at your place for the night. She smiled and placed a hand on my arm. We had one of those platonic relationships, always on the verge of turning into something more, but never doing so, as other things always got in the way. We spent the remainder of the night watching videos on the internet while trying not to doze off on the floor in our sleeping bags. We finally lost the fight around 2 in the morning. There were no more knocks that night. I woke up the next day from the sunlight pouring into the room. I rolled over, wondering what time it was and realizing that V was not in her sleeping bag. I listened out for water running in the bathroom or the shower, but I didn't hear anything. No sounds from the kitchen either. Puzzled, I fumbled for my glasses and dragged myself to my feet. I found her outside, still in her pajamas, sitting on the porch swing. She had her chin in her hands, staring at the grass by the pavement. She had her car keys, phone, and purse by her side. Hey, what's going on? She turned and gave me a small smile, then asked if we could go grab brunch somewhere. I replied sure and went back in and did a quick change. Just before I got out, she poked her head in the door and asked if I could grab the rest of her stuff. Although I felt a bit off about the abrupt end to her stay, I didn't question her. Grabbing her day clothes and toiletry bag, I headed out. We drove in her pajamas over to her place, some 20 minutes away. Then she went in to change. I waited for her in the car. We hadn't said much to each other on the drive over. I knew when she was ready, she'd tell me what was going on. We went to a nearby cafe, one of our regular haunts. As we settled down to our meal, she finally confessed she'd gone and communicated further with the knocking early this morning while I slept. I gave a deep groan and put my head in my hands. I was annoyed, but I could rarely remain angry with Vivian. V, of all the things. Why? I live there alone, and I spook easy. I'm sorry, I'd totally forgotten about it by this morning, but right as I finished brushing my teeth and stepped out into the corridor, I heard the tapping. Okay, are you sure I want to hear this? I kind of need you to hear this. I sat up, hearing the askance for help in my friend's voice. Go on then, I sighed. Look, in the documentary I watched, it was about 3 girls in the 1800s or something who claimed that their house was haunted by a spirit who let them predict the future. The spirit would communicate via knocks, 1 for yes, 2 for no. They turned the whole thing into a fortune-telling business. Some say they were eventually outed, with people discovering hidden devices under the kitchen table where they held their seances to create the rapping noises. Of course, others still believe it's a true story. She shifted nervously. So I thought I'd ask if the knocking knew the future. As easily as I spooked, I raised an eyebrow incredulously. You're joking, right? It didn't actually predict something. Did it? Well, I mean, not exactly. Not right away, she said, her arms folded as she stared at the floor. I asked if it could tell me the future. It answered yes. I didn't ask about the future to test it at first. I started by asking how many boyfriends I've had. It answered 6, by knocking that many times. But you've had 5. Well, technically, I've had 6. I just never counted the first one as a real boyfriend. Okay, creepy, but not beyond coincidence. Well, then I asked about my street number. It rapped 3 times, 4 times, then 7 times. And I guess that is correct. I'm in Unit 3, number 47. So I was convinced. She fell quiet. Then what? Then I asked when I would die. You what? She sighed. Look, I just thought I wouldn't be that serious a question to ask. Which part of knowing when you were going to die isn't that serious? I cried in apoplexy. I closed my eyes and took a very deep breath. Okay, I get it. It was surreal. This sort of thing doesn't usually happen. You got caught up in the moment, as if this were one of those internet sites where it would tell you your death date. Then what happened? She looked like she was about to cry. Well, it didn't answer at first, so I thought I was being clever. I asked how many decades I had left. No response. So I asked how many years. Still no response. Months? Nothing. Weeks? Nothing. Then I asked how many days I had left. I held my breath. 4, she said. Like I said, I spook pretty easily, and obviously, I have a soft spot for V. Inclinations for trying to communicate recklessly with the supernatural notwithstanding. So, we made a plan. The few people I had told this to had laughed, but it was what really happened. We asked ourselves how we could avoid as many horror movie tropes as possible. First things first, I decided I wasn't going to stay at my house for the next few days. Instead, I would stay with V for the whole week. I worked from home, so there was no big deal where I was staying, as long as I had my laptop. Secondly, we got into a bit of a debate about exactly what 4 days meant. Was that morning day 1, or was it day 0? Were we counting in hours from the time V asked the question? Just to accommodate for all timing constituents, we decided that days 3, 4, and 5 we would be strictly in V's unit. We would stock up on groceries and supplies and order food if we had to. V was still at university, so she'd miss a lab class, but could get all her lectures and assignments online. Thirdly, on day 4, the most likely day of the prediction, we would invite as many friends over as possible for dinner and board games. Really push the vibe as far away from spooky as possible. Also, we would have the safety of company and numbers. We figured if she was going to die from something medical and sudden, then maybe there was nothing we could do to prevent it, but we would reduce the chances of anything supernatural as much as possible by doing this. We were probably drawing inspiration from too many horror movies, but it didn't feel silly at the time. We went back to my house later that day. V wouldn't enter the house, but I steeled myself to grab whatever I needed as fast as I could. I did hear the creaking a couple of times. Really gave me a chill when I heard the sudden snap overhead in the bathroom. But I kept telling myself I didn't have to respond to it. If I didn't respond to it, then it would leave me to do my thing as it had all this time. Also, this was ridiculous, and surely V's experiments was coincidental at best. We had quite an unremarkable week, all things considered. As the 4th day came and went, V was still alive. I kept her within view most of the day. We spent the evening in the midst of board games and good company, so we barely noticed when the clock passed midnight. Nothing even remotely dangerous or creepy occurred. Then the 5th day passed without incident, and we allowed ourselves to giggle nervously at how we had believed in this kind of thing. She was even beginning to act tough again, but I know that she'd believed things enough to call her mom, who was a serious issue, during the week, just in case. By the 6th day, Saturday, I decided I should head back. I could not stay at her apartment forever, and we were both beginning to need our space. But I'll admit it, I was still spooked. It was evening when I arrived home. I was about to prepare dinner when I heard a rap. Something in me roused an emotion akin to anger. Assertiveness? I'd spent an entire week fearful and dedicated to a crazy notion that the knocking sound might have been a real supernatural thing. I was tired in a way, and aside from seriously considering selling the house I had just moved into because of an occasional creak, I decided I was just going to have to get over myself and prove that it was all rubbish. "Hello?" I said. My voice did not sound as brave as I wanted it to. There was no response. Was that you?" It was a very loud creak that made me jump. "Okay," I gasped, trying to gain control of my breathing. I could feel the blood drain out of my face. If you're real, let's make a deal." A knock. "I don't even want to see what you are. I never want to get any sense of your presence, aside from the knocking. In return, I won't do anything about you. Is that possible?" Even today, I can hardly believe I was able to muster that. And yes, I realized that my proposal was not really a sensible trade of any kind, but I doubt many would have done better in such a situation. A single knock. It agreed. Okay, cool. Then I took a deep breath, not believing this was actually communicating with me. The last thing I want to ask you, why'd you tell my friend she was going to die in 4 days? 4 sharp raps, followed by several long scratches. It felt like it was laughing. The prolonged sound made me seize up, and I fought the instinct to just get the hell out of the house and drive to my parents. You were joking?" A knock. All right. No more jokes, okay? This is really all I can handle." Silence. It remained silent for the rest of the evening. I can't believe I have ever been so scared and so brave in my life that weekend. I went about life, shutting every open door to empty rooms, turning on every single light, and having a lot of music on to change the mood. But I'd play the music only on speakers and not earphones, because I wanted to hear if anything was coming. There were creaks now and then, but they could truly have been the house settling. Or perhaps just my housemate, minding its own business. I never told anyone, but I did give the presence a nickname. I called it Knox, and it would turn out to be the friendliest of the 5 entities that presented itself in my house. I haven't even told you about my experience in the basement space yet, but I'm sure I will. I've been living in this house for about a year and a half. This happened about the 3rd month of living there. At the time, I considered my house mildly haunted. First, there's the poltergeist. I call him Knox. It's okay as long as you don't ask it any questions. It likes to answer on occasions, and the answers aren't always nice. At the start of things, all Knox would do is, well, knock. Once I acknowledged fully that Knox was an actual presence, it's not just the house settling, I started to notice it really liked to give its opinion on things. For that reason, I no longer listen to the radio, podcasts, or videos on speaker, only earphones. I suspect others, far braver than I, would be tempted to get better acquainted with Knox. I consider that an extremely rash notion. I don't know what Knox actually is, and what it can do. What if it's some weird eldritch being, living in the walls, that would drive people insane if it were ever to reveal itself? Being cordial with it is as far as I'm willing to go. In that regard, the other rule with Knox is that if it doesn't want you to be somewhere, it'll tap sharply twice. 1 for yes, 2 for no, is the clearest communication we've established between us. If I hear 2 knocks when entering a room, I just quietly leave and come back later. I've never challenged Knox about it, and I'm not finding out what's happening if I do. After a while, though, I started to notice that Knox would also move things. Plates and cups, mostly. Sometimes a cup of water. Once a cup of milk I'd left unfinished would be empty in the morning. More disturbingly, if I left food out, bread in particular, I would notice small but obvious bites taken out of it. Not mouse bites from the clearly human teeth indentations. I guess that was my motivation to keep the house clean. And in this fashion, Knox and I had gone on about our existence. Then there's the basement. I almost didn't buy the house because of the basement. There's a strange, creepy space in there, jutting into one of the walls. It's only a couple of feet deep, about chest height, and 4 feet across. It also has a yellow-painted scaffolding in it, crisscrossing it at diagonals, so it's just about impossible to store anything in it. I don't know what it's used for, but it has a presence about it. You just know you're not supposed to be in there, or even near it. I've decided not to store anything in the basement because of that. There's the house's water heating unit down there, and some leftover junk from the previous owner. Old wooden tables and chairs. I don't go there, unless it's absolutely necessary. On the handful of occasions I've had to be down there, it was only during the day. And even then, I follow the rules that as children we intuitively know when crossing dark spaces. You don't make any loud sounds or unnecessary noise, lest you annoy it or draw its attention. You don't run or rush what you're doing, lest you make it think you're afraid of or aware of it. But neither do you tarry and test its patience. And when you're done, you turn off the light and you do not look back. Here's what you need to know before I tell you the rest of the story. I'm scared of the dark. I have always been scared of the dark, since I was young. I'm not sure why. Since I've moved out by myself, learning to deal with the dark has been quite an adjustment. In those early months living here, between Knox and my nyctophobia, I'd taken to the habit of remaining in my room at night. I do all the dishes, set everything up for the next day, turn off all the lights downstairs while there's still light, then I take my provisions for the night up to my room. Snacks, drinks, instant noodles, etc. My bedroom has an attached bathroom, so there's no need to leave during the night. I even have a mini fridge in my room and a kettle. Once the bedroom door is closed, I was in my little sanctuary of pajamas, computer games, and chill hip-hop music. And my Kindle reader, of course. Knox even appeared to have the etiquette not to disturb me while I was in there. Downstairs, night would slowly fill the house and would remain still and calm till dawn. Save for the very rare need for me to creep down to grab something quickly, the elements of the house were pretty well left in harmony. I left it alone, and it left me alone. That was until my brother and his family decided to visit. I'm not close with my brother. We both tried our best to bond, I believe that, but we're just different people. That aside, I welcomed his daughter, his wife, and him happily into my new house. They plan to stay a couple of nights over the weekend. There's only one other bedroom besides mine just down the landing. Not big, but they made do. My brother and his wife would sleep in the bed, and I had a mattress for their 5-year-old daughter, Ava. Ava was a quiet child, shy, polite, and obedient. She spent most of her time in the house reading her books, scribbling her art, and watching videos on her tablet. It was about 7:30, just after delivery dinner, when Ava approached me. "Uncle, who's the little girl that lives here?" If you haven't gathered, I spook easily, and this was classic spooky. My first thought was whether Knox had revealed itself to her. It's not the first time Knox has messed around with a house guest. But, not wanting to alarm Ava, I responded with a reassuring smile. "What little girl?" "The one standing by the door of the kitchen," she said, looking towards the aforementioned kitchen. "I don't like how she looks at me. She's scary." Ava nodded in a whisper. I swallowed and felt it get stuck in my throat. Is she still there?" Ava shook her head. I walked over to the kitchen as casually as I could and took a look at the door there. It led to the basement, and it was always shut. I did not open it, instead going over to the little key rack that hung beside the sliding glass door out back. On the rack was an old-fashioned, slightly rusty key. This was the basement door key. Grabbing it, I turned smartly and locked the door with a loud clunk. I tested the handle firmly, and the door didn't budge. I went back to Ava. "There, it's locked now. Nothing's coming out of the basement." That seemed to satisfy her, and she went off to find her mother. I did think I should have told my brother and his wife, but for one reason or another, I just never brought it up in conversation. They all went to bed early that night, and I retreated into my room. I noticed before falling asleep that despite the lack of wind, the house was creaking a fair bit. On reflection, I think Knox was trying to tell me something. I was woken up by a sharp rack on my door. I came out to find my brother looking flustered. Ava was missing. My brother had roused and found her gone from the mattress. The guest bedroom door was wide open, so he thought she must have gone to the bathroom. When she didn't come back after a couple of minutes, he went to check. She wasn't in the toilet. That's when he'd woken up his wife. They'd been searching for a while before he decided to wake me up as well. I joined them in their search immediately, and we flipped on every light in every room and called for Ava. We looked into every cupboard, behind every curtain, and under all the furniture that she might fit under. Finally, my brother headed into the backyard to see if his daughter was there. It was the only door to the outside that Ava could possibly have unlocked. His wife was fervently going towards all the rooms again. To the worried feeling I had in my guts was added a sense of cold dread. I knew where Ava had gone. I glanced over to the key rack. The basement key was missing. I was certain I'd placed it back. I tested the handle to the door and found it unlocked. Swinging the door open, I was greeted by a pitch-black darkness that seemed to flow out and chill me to the bone. 2 sharp raps sounded overhead. 2 for no. I looked up a little bit surprised that Knox would care for my well-being. Or was it also scared of the basement? But my 5-year-old niece was down there, and scared as I was, I had to go down. I considered for a fleeting moment to call my brother and sister-in-law to join me, but that just didn't feel right. It was one of those rules I just knew had to be followed. Don't show it that you're scared. Don't reveal you even know it's there. Maybe that's why they always split up in horror movies. Just rules we all know, but never tell each other. I flicked the switch on to the basement. No light came on. The bulb must have gone out. Fish sticks. Ava! I called out, catching the faintest sound of movement below me. I turned on my phone flashlight and carefully descended down the flight of stairs. The last thing we needed was for me to fumble down the stairs and break a leg. I scanned the basement with the light, and the legs of the old furniture gleamed back at me, while casting shadows that spelt profane things across the wall. It was getting cold down here. My breath was misty, and the bare flesh on my arms prickled. I didn't waste time looking under the tables and chairs. I went straight for the strange space. Sure enough, there past the old diagonal scaffolding was a bundle of dark hair and pajamas. She looked to be a lot further in than the 2 feet deep I knew the space to be. "Ava," I whispered. She sniffed and turned her head to look at me, tear-stained and wide-eyed. "Come out, Ava. It's okay, I'm here." She shook her head at me, not budging. I took a deep breath, then reached in between the scaffolding. Despite having to contort myself between the bars, I was able to grab Ava under the arms and gently gather her to me. She broke out in a loud sob as she clutched at my shirt and buried her head into my shoulder. The cold suddenly flipped into suffocating heat. I felt sick from under the change in temperature. I still was guided only by the light of my phone, and I headed for the stairs. Was it dark? I felt my visibility was poorer than before. The stack of upside-down furniture, though being no more than a few feet in length, suddenly felt like a corridor stretching away. I swatted my hand holding the phone as I tried to push back the darkness. The flare of my light did little to the mad dance, throwing shadows in all directions, but I didn't stare too hard at the shapes in the dark. I didn't want to make out the silhouette of a little girl. Instead, I focused all my effort into pushing past that pile of furniture, stumbling up the stairs and bursting into the orange light of the kitchen. I collapsed to my knees, still holding Ava, and was panting like I'd run a marathon. My sister-in-law saw us, gasped, and immediately ran over. She was weeping in relief. My brother came in from the backyard then, As I released Ava to her parents, I caught something from her little fist, the basement door key. "Why did you go down there, baby?" my sister-in-law asked. Ava wasn't able to answer as she wailed. I didn't blame her. I was just about to wail myself. "You're bleeding," I heard my brother say. He pointed at my leg, and I looked down and saw a bright red stain slowly spreading across my trouser leg. I gingerly pulled it back, peeling away my skin to reveal several long scratches across the back of my leg, like something had tried to grab my heel. "Must have scraped something down there," I mumbled. Now that I was aware of them and the adrenaline was petering out, the wound was really beginning to sting. My brother said something about having the scratches checked out in case of tetanus or something. Then he and his wife turned their attention to their inconsolable daughter and headed back to their room, leaving me alone with the gaping black of the basement door. I could feel menace radiating from the darkness, very cautious to make no sudden moves as though the door were the open maw of an alligator. I slowly swung the door shut. Even shut, I could feel the hatred beating against it from the other side. I placed the key into the keyhole and locked it, then allowed myself to breathe once again. 2 sharp raps sounded overhead. Yeah, I know, Knox. It wasn't over. My brother and family decided in the morning not to stay in the house. They hadn't been able to get much out of Ava, but they definitely got the picture she did not want to be back in my house. I felt exactly the same way. They packed up and made ready to leave. Ava came up to me to get a cuddle goodbye. I knelt down to her level and she gave me a knowing look. "Was it the little girl?" I asked. "She said I had to, or she'd eat my mom and dad," Ava said with a nod. I think my mind went blank after that. I don't remember saying goodbye to my brother and his wife. I don't remember the car leaving. I just remember standing in the driveway, facing my house, and wondering whether I should go in or not. My leg was beginning to ache from the gashes on it. I hadn't done much other than to dab it with a tissue to make the bleeding stop. They were deeper than I thought, and they had a ragged quality to them. Finally, I decided I'd find a clinic open on Saturday and have it bandaged properly while I considered what to do. I passed by the basement door to get ready. In the morning light, that hateful aura was missing from the door. Well, that was a relief at least. When I saw the doctor, he asked me if I'd been attacked. I laughed sheepishly and said it was some furniture in the corner. He raised an eyebrow at me quizzically, then silently raised a hand, made it into a claw, and gently drew it across the bandage where the cut had been. Those cuts certainly weren't made by furniture in the corner, not even by an animal's claw. They'd been made by a hand. "Are you sure you're safe? Do you need any help?" the doctor asked kindly. I was sure I was not safe, and I was very sure I needed help, but I shook my head. What could I say? I had been abused by a demonic entity in my basement, getting nothing else out of me. The doctor resigned to put accident down on the cause of injury. It had been a long wait to see the doctor, so it was well after lunch when I left the clinic. I sat down at a fast food outlet, still unsure of what to do when my brother called me. He told me they had relocated to a hotel somewhere in the city, and I was welcome to join them for dinner. I said sure. Heck, it was my treat after a bad night, I said. He chuckled softly and said dealing with night terrors was all part of being a parent. Then he also said they realized that they were missing a milk bottle. They think Ava had been holding a milk bottle when she went down to the basement, as she usually fell asleep with one. I told my brother I'd look, even though I wasn't going to step foot in that basement for $1 million. I have a problem saying no, though. I sat down the phone and thought about the basement with the milk bottle lying in that odd, ominous space, collecting dust. That's when it hit me. The milk. The cups of liquid that were finished by morning. The nibbles of bread I left out. What if it hadn't been Knox? What if the thing in the basement wandered out at night and ate things? I squirmed at the thought, but I remembered once having visited some old cottages while on tour in the UK. The guide had pointed out a metal saucer of milk and some biscuits, artfully sat across a large flat rock close to the cottage entrance. Apparently it was a centuries-old tradition from the homeowner to leave milk and biscuits out for the fae that wandered through and around the house in the witching hours. He also pointed to a corner of the building where the angle had been beveled away. He said it was because they believed the stone intruded upon a fae path, so they cut it away to let the fae folk pass unhindered. The joke was that the cottage was haunted too, but the inhabitants were far more afraid of angering the fae than the resident ghosts. Did I now find myself in a similar position? I went home and packed a bag. I would have cleaned my house up after the guests left, and there was no presence from the basement door in the light of day, but my imagination wouldn't stop me wondering if I'd turned a corner or opened a door to find some scary little girl looking at me. 100 times, absolutely not. I had decided that I would test this fae theory of mine before making any further decisions. Just before I left, I poured a glass of milk and left it to the side of the basement door with a slice of bread. Then, making sure it was the very last thing I had to do, I unlocked the basement and hurried out the front door. I went out for dinner with my brother and his family. Ava seemed to have mostly recovered from her previous night's trauma. They didn't ask me about the missing bottle. Maybe they forgot, or maybe they knew something was off with the basement. I didn't tell anyone I wasn't going home that night. Instead, I spent an uneasy night in a cheap motel reading up on folklore. Turns out there's a lot of cultures where people leave out milk, food, even animal blood, just around the house to appease strange nocturnal humanoid creatures. Some of those creatures play pranks. Others suck the blood out of your toes and stole babies out of their cribs. Charming. In the morning, I headed back to my house. First thing I did was walk very cautiously over to the kitchen. Sure enough, the milk was at a lower level than when I'd left it. There were also nibbles out of the bread. A sharp rap came from somewhere deep in the house. One knock for yes. That first day, I waited for nightfall in the kitchen. I had a bag packed in the car just in case I needed to, make a break for it. I was breaking out in a cold sweat, but I held my ground. The aura of menace never came out of the door. At around 1 in the morning, I very cautiously went up to my room and locked my door. As an extra precaution, thanks to my research, I poured a line of iron filings along the threshold of my room. Fae don't like iron, right? At least that's what the stories say. The sense of fear never returned to the basement door for a long time. And that seems to be how I formed a truce with the thing living in the basement. Every night I leave milk and a piece of bread on the kitchen floor by the basement door. It doesn't always eat it. One last note, and I add this as a note because I'm still unsure of what I saw was true or not. One night I was at home late for some reason or another. I hastily washed the dishes, locked the doors, and set out my peace offering on the kitchen floor. It was dark by then, and the windows were black panes. I turned the lights off one by one, backing towards the stairs, handing ownership of the downstairs to the night things. I ascended to the upper floor and finally turned off the stair lights. Besides the other night, fleeing with Ava through the basement, of which I received scratches on my calf as payment for breaking the rules, it was the only time I ever broke the rules. Maybe I heard something or saw something out of the corner of my eye. For whatever reason, I turned around and looked down into the darkness. There, on the 3rd or 4th step of the stairs, was a pale, small hand raised out and reaching towards me. It connected to an impossibly long arm that snaked towards the kitchen, losing itself around the corner. In an instant, it whipped back into the shadows, out of sight. It was so fast, the whole thing might have just been a trick of my eyes. Regardless, I fled to my room and never ever glanced back into the darkness of the house again. I would like to say that besides that possible imaginary instance, I had no further dealings with the thing in the basement. But that's not the case. No, I'm afraid, as mad as it might sound, I would need its help, as the house went from mildly haunted to What the heck am I gonna do now? I have two problems that I'm always a little embarrassed to admit to, because there's always those who believe neither to be the real problem. The first problem is that I've had no long-term relationships in a long time. The second is that my house is haunted. Cue people lecturing me about priorities and handing me unsolicited life advice. I mention these things more to explain how the third of the 5 entities came to join my house. This was coming to a year of me living at the house. By that time, I'd set up a working, if not uncomfortable, relationship with the 2 entities. Knox, the first entity you might remember, communicates by creaking the house. 1 for yes, 2 for no. If I enter a room and I hear 2 knocks, I leave and return later. Other than that, communication between the 2 of us is seldom. The second entity lives in the basement and is appeased by milk and bread that I leave out every night. Truth be told, I don't know what guarantees my offerings confer upon me. I know it wanders around the house some nights, in some form. Because of that, I only leave my bedroom out of absolute necessity once it's dark. It has left me mostly unmolested in the sanctuary of my bedroom. Perhaps that's because I have left a line of iron dust along the threshold every night. It's surprising how quickly we can normalize lousy situations. There I was, having gotten so used to the little rituals in my life that kept the shadows at bay, I was beginning to divert my attention to other things, like the absence of a love life. I'm not great with online dating. My social circles have been frozen since graduation, plus I work from home mostly. Added to the challenge of finding dates, I was constantly wondering how on earth I would take a girl home to a haunted house. That was how I met Ella. Ella was the exact opposite of a girl that I would bring home to meet my mother. She was tattooed, pierced in all the wrong places. Well, all the right places, if you're me, I suppose. She smoked, wore heavy makeup, her thick, wavy hair dyed an electric purple. We met at a geek convention in another town. She was a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, and we learned we both lived in the same city. We somehow ended up hanging out around the same group because of, shared hometown, and although I couldn't take my eyes off of her, I had no idea how to strike up a conversation with her. My friend Vivian, however, forever my wingman, noticed me eyeing Ella, but doing nothing about it. So, she happened to let spill in conversation that I lived in a haunted house. Really? Ella squealed, her pink contacts locking with mine properly for the first time. I actually don't like talking about the conditions of my house. It's like thinking about a room that you should have cleaned out months ago. Except now the pile of clothes on the floor has been lying there for so long, it's developed a taste for human flesh. Yeah, I found myself saying, like really haunted. I don't actually know why you still live there, V added. Ella clapped her hands like a little girl. Oh my God, all right, tell me everything. So I did. She listened intently, gasping and nodding all the time. I don't remember any girl giving me this much attention for quite some time. Listen, you may not believe me, but I've been living with my guardian spirit and a whole bunch of other spirits my entire life. I've got the third eye, and I can see things that people can't. It's so rare to find a real haunting. Can I please visit your house? Ella begged. That's when several alarm bells started going off in my head. Firstly, who on earth goes out seeking these kinds of things with such glee? Secondly, bringing someone into the house who was so eager to get a reaction from the entities sounded as good an idea as poking a bear. Knox had proven to be benign. The basement thing, on the other hand, I was certain had the capacity to maim and kill. But in a city far from home, under bright sunshine, with the rapt attention of a beautiful girl, I said I suppose she could try. As the convention went on, Ella became quite friendly with me. Yet, it still surprised me that she said yes when I asked her out on a date. We went on our first date the evening the convention ended. Before we parted, she gave me a kiss on the cheek, and I promised her a tour of my house. A week later, Friday afternoon, she came over. When she got out of her car, she was rapt. I don't know what she saw when she looked at my house, but I guess it was everything she had hoped for. Now that it was actually happening, I was pretty nervous as I brought her around the place. Knox stayed strangely quiet. Perhaps he was used to people being apprehensive, as opposed to enthusiastic. However, upon entering the laundry room, 2 sharp raps sounded on the wall. Ella laughed excitedly and put her hands over her mouth. I quickly grabbed her by the shoulder and led her out of the room. I hesitated at the basement door, but she really wanted to go down there. It was the main attraction, after all. I'd been down there before, but that was before my last harrowing experience. Since then, I actually hadn't gone down there. It was still daylight, and the basement thing seemed dormant by day. So, not believing what I was doing for a pretty girl, I agreed to a very short visit downstairs. I warned her to keep her voice low, and she promised that if I said to leave, she would leave. She promised. So, very cautiously, I opened the basement door. I had not fixed the broken light in there, but there was enough light from the kitchen we could see all the way down. Holding her hand, I led her down the stairs. It was as I remembered it. Old, dusty tables with chairs stacked upside down against one wall. A little further on the opposite wall, an odd opening jutted into it. I've never understood what that space was for. You might have a small fridge in it if you were lucky, and only if it was lying on its side. Were it not for the yellow-painted diagonal scaffolding that crisscrossed it, that was. The space was its lair. Ella suddenly went ahead of me and approached it. I gripped her hand, and she turned back to look at me with a smile and intent in her eye. I shook my head at her, but she let my hand fall and approached the space noiselessly. She placed her hands within the foreboding area and beamed to herself. I would have grabbed her and forced her out of the basement, had I not been terrified of waking the entity with noise and clamor. To my relief, Ella retreated, seeming satisfied. She reached back, holding my hand again, and we left the basement. Once we were out and I'd shut the basement door, Ella burst into squealing joy. "That was amazing! I've never felt such an aura. Trust me, I have spent nights in so many abandoned buildings and so many graveyards. Most everything's rubbish, but oh my God, you have the real deal." It was about 4 in the afternoon then. It was still light, but for the last few months I tended to have dinner early so that I could retreat to my bedroom well before night. This led to an odd puzzle I'd been musing over. If I chose to bring Ella out for dinner, I might be returning to the house well after dark, which was far from preferable. If we ate at home, I would have to ask Ella to leave early, which seemed a little rude and against my wishes to spend more time with her. Ella provided the solution before I even presented the option to her. "Would you mind if I stayed the night?" I gulped nervously. Well, I could cook us an early dinner, and I guess we could watch a movie in my room. It's the safest place in the house after dark." She nodded enthusiastically, with bright, shining eyes. I'll spare everyone the details of the evening, but let's just say being in a haunted house really excited her. Something weird happened in the morning, though. I went into the attached bathroom to brush my teeth. Looking in the mirror, I saw Ella pop her head around the corner and look at me. It was only for a moment, then she ducked out. I finished brushing my teeth and went back into the bedroom. Ella was under the covers, still looking asleep. "You can use the bathroom now," I said. "Huh?" she said, sleepily turning over. "Oh, I thought you wanted the bathroom." She shook her head, her purple hair rippling across her face. Before I could pursue the matter any further, she got up and let the blankets fall off and pulled me into a kiss. Any questions I had blanked out of my mind. Like I said, the house really seemed to excite her. She was back a couple of weeks later. She would have returned sooner, but she had work stuff. She worked at a gallery and a series of event centers, and they'd had some talks that night. When she got out of her car, she was wearing an outfit that most certainly got my blood running. Whatever excitement I might have felt was put to a slow death when she opened her passenger door to reveal the most terrifying object I'd ever seen. An old, weathered doll. I'm even more petrified of dolls than I am of the dark, and that's saying something. "Hey, I want you to meet my lifelong friend, Edward. He's my spirit guide, and he's so happy to be here," she said, introducing the doll. Edward was a thing of my nightmares. Seeming made of pink plastic, he was 4 feet in length and wore a faded sleeping gown that matched his nightcap. It may have once sported some kind of pattern of sorts, but it now just looked blotched and diseased. His face was worn, and worse, the paint was stained and smeared in all manner of ways, giving the doll the impression of having been melted in a fire, as well as mauled by a bear, maybe. It seemed to glare at me with its jet black eyes, and its smile was unsettling, to say the least, like a snake that spotted its next meal. He was my Nan's. That's great. Hey, Ed, you're not bringing him inside, are you? Ella smiled at me and put a hand on my arm. She stood beside me, turning to face the creepy doll sitting in the car. Then she whispered in my ear, "Don't call him Ed. He doesn't like it. It's Edward. And of course I'm bringing him into the house." Look, I really don't think that's a good idea. It's okay. Edward can move around a bit on his own, but he's never hurt me, and there's his seal," she said. She lifted his nightcap and showed me a strange symbol that had been seared into his bald plastic head. She put it back down. "Nan told me that he's safe as long as the seal remains intact. He moves around? Just a little. He's not coming into the house." Ella made a face that seemed to ask if I was serious and call me a coward at the same time. Then she suddenly had a look on her face like she was hearing something that only she could really hear, and she leaned towards Edward. "Huh? Oh, okay. Edward says he understands and he'll stay in the car." She closed the car door and looked mildly disappointed, but she gave me a smile and grabbed my hand as she led me into the house. I noted that she hadn't locked her car, but didn't say anything, as I felt I'd gotten as much of a compromise as I was going to get. I could feel the doll's eyes on me all the way back to the house. We'd finished watching a movie together in bed, and it was close to midnight. Ella was lying against me, and I could tell that she was bored. Suddenly, she sat up with a mischievous grin on her face. "Let's go." Go where?" "Explore your house, duh." "Ella, I know you're really into this kind of thing, but the basement thing isn't something that you want to mess with." "I have protection," she said dismissively. "Come on, let's go. I can't believe you're not curious." I'm very not curious. What do you mean protection?" "Look, I don't want to get into it, but I used to be in a sisterhood, and we made deals. It was kind of messed up, and I got out okay, but some of those contracts were binding, both ways, so things don't mess with me, and I have Edward. Come on." Her plastic friend's protection was not convincing, and I didn't budge an inch. "All right, fine," she said, a wild gleam in her eye. "I'm going by myself. You wait here." What? Wait, no!" But she'd already flung the door open and run out into the house. It had been a while since I faced the darkness of my home. I heard her footsteps going down the stairs. Then she said something that I couldn't quite make out. I was frozen on my bed, listening for more sounds, but there was only silence. When I couldn't take it anymore, I crept out of bed and approached the open door. "Ella," I said, my voice hoarse. There was no response down the stairs. I looked on the floor and noted that her feet had scraped my iron filings aside. I grabbed a small broom I had and put them back in a line across the threshold, hoping to keep whatever was in the basement at bay. Then I took a step over the black dust line into the corridor. 2 groans shuddered through the house. 2 for no. It was Knox. But I had never heard it sound like that before. Deep and loud. I got the impression of a cat bristling, trying to appear 3 times its size. Was Knox angry? Or was he scared? The last time I went against Knox's advice had been when my niece had gone into the basement. But the circumstances felt different now. My instincts screamed at me, and I made my way down the stairs despite them. At the top of the landing, I flicked on the stair light. Edward stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me. "God!" I yelled, falling over. I scrambled backwards till my back hit the wall. Edward's eyes appeared black and empty, like a shark's. "Ella!" I cried out. "I thought we agreed the doll stays in the car." There was no reply. "Ella!" I called out again. "I'm going back in my room and locking the door." Still no response. "If you want back in, just knock on the door and tell me, okay?" Picking myself up, I ran back to my room, constantly glancing back at the stairs, half expecting Edward to appear on the landing. I slammed the door behind me, flipped the lock, and slid to the floor, breathing hard. Hours went by, and I didn't hear a sound for the rest of the night. Not even the creak of wood from Knox. I think I fell asleep with my back against the door, because I suddenly realized it was dawn. My windows were gray, and I could make out the silhouette of the treetops. I really needed the bathroom at that point. Hoping the morning brought my usual safety, I left my vigil over the door and went to the bathroom. Just in the middle of my business, I saw movement in the mirror. I couldn't see directly into my room, but I could see into the bedroom via the mirror. It was Ella. She appeared to have entered the bedroom and was crossing to the other side. To get her phone, maybe, I thought. "Ella?" I called out. Pulling up my pants and flushing the toilet, I hurried out, but Ella wasn't in the room. My room door was locked. How had she gotten in? How had she gotten out again? I didn't see her phone either. Had she taken it downstairs with her last night? I decided my sleep-deprived brain was just playing tricks on me. Frowning, I steeled myself and opened the bedroom door. The landing was empty. I stepped out into the corridor, listening for Knox to sound again, but I only heard morning birdsong. Very gingerly, I tiptoed to the stairs and looked down. Edward was nowhere to be found. I descended to the ground floor, and the house felt empty. Neither Edward nor Ella were anywhere to be seen. When I checked the driveway, her car was gone. When I'd gone through all the rooms, just in case Edward was hiding somewhere, I sighed, got my phone, and called Ella. She didn't pick up. I sent her a few messages throughout the morning, but I got no reply. Feeling lost about what to do, I began cleaning up the house. But as time went on, I began to get that odd feeling that I wasn't alone. While Knox was a somewhat omnipresent being in the house, I hadn't felt spooked by it for a long time. I started to get goosebumps. Someone or something was watching me. My next glimpse of what it was happened in my garage. There's a long, full-length mirror stood against the wall in there that I'd never found a place for, so there it stayed. I saw Ella in it, poking her head out from one side of the garage entrance. I spun around thinking she'd come back, but there was no one there. I went outside, but I didn't see her car either. I heard a creak from the house. Knox? What was that supposed to mean? A bit later, still feeling lost, I decided I'd drive to the supermarket and stock up. The store wasn't far, and being around people milling and shopping might make me feel better. The fear from the previous night had turned into disappointment that Ella had just vanished on me. I was driving home when I glanced into the rearview mirror, and Ella was staring back at me from the back seat. I screamed, accidentally stepping on the gas, and sent my car up the curve. The car jolted to a stop before I hit a small tree and somehow managed to unfasten my seatbelt, tumbling out the door and scrambling away from the vehicle. But I stopped after a few feet. What if Ella was stuck in the car and needed help? I came back to the car, cautiously, as though it might blow up any second. But the back seat was empty. It wasn't just that Ella shouldn't have been in the back seat of my car. It was the expression she'd had. She'd been smiling at me with a deranged look in her eye. I checked all my tires, and it appeared intact. The car looked drivable, but I didn't want to drive. I didn't even want to test it. Instead, I called V. "Hey, I really need your help." She must have heard the tension in my voice. Without question, she rolled up to me 20 minutes later. "You okay?" she asked, getting out of the car. Yeah, I'm fine. I don't think I can drive right now." V frowned at me and looked at the car. "I can take you home, but what are you going to do about your car?" We were in a small housing estate, and the road itself was pretty quiet. No one had come out to see what had happened during the accident. "You reckon I could leave it here for the night?" I asked. V shrugged. "Well, at least park it straight. Here, give me your keys." I handed V the keys, hoping it would be safe to let her inside the car. She parked the car without incident and came out. I felt relieved when she was fine, but then I felt sick. V gave me a concerned look as she walked back to me. "Hey, what's going on? Talk to me." I could only stare at the ground, not even sure where to start. Evening was coming, and shadows were drawing up long across the ground. Do you think I could stay at yours tonight?" I asked V. "I don't think my house is safe to go back to. I don't think I should be alone." V put her arms around me and led me back to her car. I totally forgot about my groceries. I sat in the passenger seat and was silent the whole drive, doing my best not to look into the mirror. When we got to V's, I broke down and cried. V hugged me and rubbed my back as though I were a kid. After a bit, while holding back sobs, I told V what had transpired over the last couple of weeks. She nodded in an understanding manner and didn't interrupt. At the end of it, she took a look around her house, stood up, and started putting stuff away. I realized she was clearing away anything that had a reflection on it. When she was done, she sat opposite me and took out her phone. "Well," she said in a problematic tone, "I think it's time you got some help." "What, a psychologist?" "No, I was thinking more exorcist." "What?" "Maybe a priest or a pastor." I decided to open my phone and start searching too. Just as I was about to press the first link on my search bar, my phone started ringing. "Ella?" I said, putting the phone to my ear. V looked back as her eyebrows raised. "Hey, can we meet, like somewhere in town?" "Yeah," I said slowly. I have questions." I know, I'm sorry," Ella replied. She gave me the address of a cafe in town. "I'll tell you what I can when we meet," she said, and abruptly put the phone down. V had her arms crossed when I looked up at her. Could you give me a ride?" "She better have a good explanation," V said, getting up and grabbing her jacket. The cafe had a small park across from it. V said she'd sit on a bench at the edge of the park, keeping me in sight. Ella was already sitting at a table out on the footpath with a cup of coffee before her. She wasn't drinking it, and she looked embarrassed. I took a seat opposite her. Hey, she said softly, trying to give me a smile. "So, you've been gone for less than a day, but I'm already seeing you everywhere I go," I said with a nervous grin. It wasn't a good joke. "Yeah," she said incredulously. "I know what you mean. Want to tell me what that's about?" "It's Edward," she said with a half whisper. "He doesn't like you. He really doesn't like you." That made me grit my teeth in anger for some reason. "Feeling is definitely mutual. He doesn't want us to spend time with each other anymore, Ella said, staring into her cup. Have you considered that taking relationship advice from a possessed doll is incredibly unhealthy? Says the guy who refuses to move out of his haunted house. Touché, I said with a sigh. Look, I'm sorry. I like you. I really do. You're a sweet guy. You deserve much better, but Edward's all the family I have left. Family? It was Ella's turn to sigh. Sorry, but I have to listen to him. There were tears in her eyes now. No, you don't, Ella, I said, reaching out to hold her hand. Her hand shrank away from mine. He let loose one of them on you, she said quietly. I paused. In my sad, pathetic life, I've done a lot of stupid things. Some bad things. Some of them have led to spirits being attached to me. There's always Edward. I was hoping since you already lived in a haunted house, you would find me and these bizarre things I come with acceptable, I guess. Ella, She raised a hand and cut me off. She took a shaky breath and then mumbled something. I only caught the start of her sentence. He unleashed the... Unleashed the what? Its name means the one who walks the mirrors. It was one of the spirits Edward's protecting me from. I think he trapped it within himself. Now he's let it go. It'll haunt your reflection, traveling from one mirror to the next. It can even come out, I think. My blood ran cold. I stopped breathing. Can it be stopped? Ella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I'm sorry. I've said too much already. Then, before I could stop her, she ran to her car. Wait, why does it look like you? What does it want? I cried after her. She didn't answer. She got into her car and started the engine. I saw Edward strapped into the passenger seat. I could feel those venomous black eyes boring into me. As Ella drove past, I swear the thing turned to stare at me. Have you ever felt so scared that your guts feel like they're going to empty its contents in both directions at the same time? Yet at the same time, a desperate anger lit a small flame against the hopelessness inside of me. It was the smile on Edward's face that did it. It was a victorious smile. Edward had gotten the girl and destroyed his competition. Except I wasn't destroyed yet, was I? My muscles felt like they were made of jelly, but somehow I stood up in defiance with my fist clenched, staring at Ella's car as it drove out of sight. V had crossed the road and was approaching me. What happened? Are you okay? I turned to V. I was shivering badly, but I couldn't tell from dread or fury. I got a plan, I told her through gritted teeth. That doll. That goddamn doll. It thought I didn't remember what the symbol on its head looked like. Later at my house, I think it was about 10:30, I stood with V in the living room. She was holding a simple hand mirror. I was preparing a couple of things on the countertop. You're crazy. This is the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I've seen some pretty dumb stuff. Yeah, I grimaced. Knox had been quiet. There was no presence from the basement either. It was as if both understood that what I was doing was important, and they were giving me room to do so. V had been uncomfortable entering the house. She had a bad experience with Knox once. I told you about that. I told her she didn't need to do this for me, but she insisted that someone had to save my ass if everything went to hell. I felt it approaching. The feeling that I was being watched deepened. I put my finger to my lips and V simmered down. Silently, I motioned for V to pass me the hand mirror. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and held it up so I could see my face in it. I then angled it so I could see over my shoulder. Behind me was the archway to the kitchen, which was lit by a soft orange glow. I didn't have to wait long. Something that might have been Ella popped its head to the right of the arch, then ducked away. The hair on my neck stood on end. A few minutes crept by, and V was shifting uncomfortably, foot to foot, her eyes darting from one shadow to another. I kept my eyes on the mirror, though. Then, even though I was expecting it, it was all I could do not to scream as a pale face with purple hair peeked over my shoulder. It smiled at me with a thin black smile and stared at me with unblinking eyes. It didn't really look like Ella, not close up. I frowned back at it, waiting to see what it would do. I think my defiance angered it, as its smile turned into a baring of teeth that were long and inhuman. I heard V gasp by my side. I think she had seen it in the mirror. Her gasp made me take my eyes off it for a split second. When I glanced back, I saw a white hand shooting out, filling the whole mirror, as if it meant to grab my face. I let go of the mirror and ducked to avoid the grasping hand. The mirror and I tumbled onto the carpeted floor, and V shrieked. That's when it got quiet. I got up and looked down. The mirror had landed face up, and I could see the thing thrashing about inside it. It appeared to be snarling and screaming, but I could hear nothing. Its background seemed to have frozen too. Rather than the ceiling, the mirror contained the living room and the kitchen archway, the same as it had when I was holding it. The thing was running around the mirror room in a hobbling fashion, but it didn't seem to be able to find its way out. It just kept running back and forth, and then it returned to the mirror's surface to thump and scream against it once more. I could hear V screaming her head off. Slowly I knelt down and held the mirror by its handle, lifting it up. I felt like I had a deadly spider in my hand, separated by a thin layer of glass in the container. "You're insane. You are actually insane," I heard V still going on. In the reverse of the mirror, I had etched onto the plastic the symbol I'd seen on Edward's cap. My gamble had worked. I'd lured the mirror demon into this mirror, on the off chance that the seal would trap it within. The theory could have gone wrong on so many levels. What if it required more than just the symbol to turn the mirror into a trap? What if the mirror demon couldn't be trapped the same way that Edward had in the doll? What if the mirror demon had used a different mirror to attack me? I don't know. All I knew was that it had worked. I put the mirror in a soft cloth bag and tightened the drawstring. Then I put the bag into a small safe box I had previously used for my passports and things. I'd stuffed it full of padding. I heard the safe box click as the numbers went back into something that wasn't the combination. I also put a padlock onto the ring that it had. On the safe and the padlock, I also drew the symbol with the permanent marker. V appeared to have calmed down somewhat now that the mirror was out of sight. "All right," she said, trying to catch her breath. "Okay, you caught the thing. Congrats, genius. You won. What now?" I stepped back from the locked safe, blood still rushing in my ears as I breathed heavily. V was right. I'd won. I'd allowed the feeling of victory to wash over me. For a moment, I felt like I could have taken on the entire world. Then I remembered the thing in the basement. My courage was somewhat humbled. Now I think I'm going to drink a very large glass of water. Then one day I'm going to cover this safe in cement. Then I'm somehow going to get a boat and drop it in the middle of the ocean. A single rap sounded from somewhere in the house. Vivian jumped as ever. It's okay, I said, putting a hand on her to calm her. I think the house was agreeing with me. Hey, that offer to stay over at yours still stand? V nodded at me and looked pale, unconvinced that Knox meant her no harm. Let's say we get out of here then. I put the safe in my closet, then closed up the house. V followed me close everywhere, and Knox was very polite about not scaring her further. I left extra milk and bread by the basement as a thank you for giving me my space. I hope it understood the gesture. Then we left my house of horrors, at least for that night. What follows, I guess, is a bit of epilogue on the whole affair, and the preemptive questions I'm anticipating. Firstly, yes, V is a good friend whom I'm surprised to be blessed with. I surprised her the week after with a brand new game console that I know she'd been waiting for. Then there's the issue of keeping the mirror. Would smashing the mirror kill the thing or release it? I don't know. I felt unconfident about testing it. So I didn't break it. I faced the problem and kept wanting to keep it in sight at all times, not wanting it out of sight ever. In the end, I compromised on my rule. I cooperated with Knox. It seemed to not like the thing any more than I did. We found a place in the house it approved of hiding it. I won't say where. Then I just trusted that Knox would guard it and warn me if anything happened. If anyone's going to ask me what the symbol is, I won't tell you. V thinks that it might get Colts or something looking for me, and I've got enough problems to deal with. Thank you very much. Sorry, I truly hope I don't run into the mirror demon again. Finally, was I serious about cementing the mirror and dropping it in the ocean? I was, in fact. I just have to find someone who's willing to take on a job like that, of cementing a mystery box when other things started to happen. It's not the last time I had to deal with the mirror demon. There's still Entity 4 and 5 to tell you about, though. Perhaps I'll tell you a little more sometime. I was woken up by a sharp creaking somewhere above my head. My clock told me it was 5 in the morning. The house continued to creak, sounding oddly like a crow cawing. As a rule, I don't leave my room till morning. Not only am I afraid of the dark, but I live in a haunted house. It's true, since I'd moved in a year before, I discovered that not one, but 2 non-human residents exist here. And as if my house wasn't full enough, I recently added a 3rd to the mix. The creaking wasn't just the wind. It was the first entity, Knox. Knox rarely bothers me in my bedroom, and I'd never woken up to hear him before. I just wanted to roll back under my blankets, but knowing I wouldn't get back to sleep, I instead flicked on the lamp on my nightstand. The wood noises stopped abruptly and were replaced by the sound of a whistling wind. Something about the wind struck me as strange. I got out of bed and unlocked my door, opening it just a fraction and very nervously peering out through the slit. The landing was dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could still hear the wind. It took me a minute to realize the sound was coming from inside, not outside the house. Was there a window or a door open? I glumly decided that this was one of the times I was going to have to be brave, and went down. Somehow I knew it before I even saw it. I knew it would be Brian. I knew he must have broken back into the house to explore the tunnel he'd found. The sliding door in the kitchen that led out to the backyard was ajar, and I could see Brian sitting there on a stool by the dining table. He was a dark silhouette against the distant streetlight. I felt indignant rage rising up in me like bile. "Brian, I wasn't kidding. I'm going to call the police," I said, as I flicked on the orange kitchen light. His back was to me, and he was hunched over the dining table, hands clutching desperately at his hair. A muffled but continuous moan was coming from him, and that's when I noticed a dark liquid dripping onto the dining room floor. "Brian?" He stood up suddenly, the stool clattering to the floor, and turned to me. I felt something splatter my clothes and tasted iron in my mouth. He fumbled forward, arms flailing wildly and clutching the air, as if he was going to grab me. The horrible moan turned into a raspy scream, and as my brain slowly came to grips with what I was seeing, I finally registered that his eyes and tongue had been torn out. I don't talk much about my family. I guess the trending word to describe it these days is toxic. My aunt serves as kind of a matriarch of the family. Something about the inheritance, being the favorite child of my grandparents, other stuff like that I've never bothered to understand. It lets her wield some sort of power over them. That's not to say that I have a great relationship, even with my own parents. I don't wash my family's dirty laundry in public, suffice to say. It was a beastly thing to deal with. I guess that's why I was so eager to gain independence. I moved out and bought this house and keep my family several states away, only to find myself haunted. Sounds like I'm about to blame my parents for this mess I'm in, doesn't it? That would be unfair. However, I can't help but think that my family's dysfunction was reasonably responsible for what was happening to my cousin when he discovered the fourth entity I share my house with. My aunt holds me completely responsible for what's happened to her son. I'm officially not welcome at any family gatherings where she's involved, which is most of them. I think I'm cut off from whatever the inheritance is, too. I honestly couldn't care less. But that's not the point. I actually do feel quite sorry for what happened to my cousin. Some days I even feel a little guilty. If only I'd stood my ground and not let him stay at all, or kicked him out early. Boundaries, right? Not even a month has passed since I dealt with the third entity, when I got a phone call from my mom. I only get phone calls from her when she wants something. Hey, your cousin Brian's moving to your city. He needs a place to stay. Do you think he could live with you? Sorry, Mom, but my place isn't suitable for anyone to visit right now. I'm actually having quite a lot to deal with. You think you're the only one with problems? Come on, I know you got a spare room. Just let your cousin stay. You know your aunt helped us out a lot when you were young, right? No, Mom, I've been through enough. It's been a lot lately. You wanted to move out? You didn't have to move out. Now that you're out and you're learning how hard it is to have responsibility, you'll want to be selfish and not help anyone. Do you think it's right that other people should have problems just because you wanted to create your own problems? You know your cousin can't hold down a job. At least let him stay until he finds one, okay? You know how hard it is for your dad and me when your aunt is angry with us. We let you go and live by yourself. You're making money now, right? And we haven't asked for any of that. I think you can help a family member out this once, don't you? Okay, fine, I said. He has 2 weeks, then he better be moving out. Don't be like that. You help him out for as long as he needs. I'll tell your aunt, my mom snapped and put the phone down before I could protest. Fish sticks. She messaged me later to tell me that Brian would be arriving in 2 days. I'm uncomfortable with anyone staying overnight at my place. My brush-ins with the 3 previous entities had involved people staying over. This wasn't just anyone either. This was Brian. This was drug dealer Brian. This was fired from 7 jobs Brian. This was sets fire to his school Brian. This was killed his girlfriend in a car accident while driving drunk and still totaling the next car he got while drunk driving again Brian. But Brian evidently had a problem following rules, and there were rules for living at my house that ought to be respected. I tried making a quick list in my head. If you hear 2 knocks in a room, leave and return later. Do not disturb the milk and bread by the basement door. Do not enter the basement without consulting me first. Do not wander around the house at night, unless absolutely necessary. Do not break the lines of black dust, the iron filings, at the threshold of bedroom doors. If you do, sweep them back into place. Inform me immediately if you see anyone or something strange in the mirrors. Brian arrived as scheduled. How was he still permitted to have a driver's license after that, I don't know, but he's a fair bit larger than me, taller and wider. Dude, Brian said, coming out of his car, this is your place? Man, what a dump. I didn't bother to reply. Was it strange to feel offended over my haunted house? I gave him my best dirty look. Hey man, I'm starving. You got any food? He said, completely unfazed. Dinner's at 5, Brian. Bring your things up to the guest room. There had been no talk of being paid for accommodations or groceries from his mother, my aunt, or Brian. Was I expected to house and feed this guy for free? He only had a couple of bags with him, which he hoisted on his right shoulder. Then he trudged in, followed me up to the guest room. I scowled at the boot prints he trailed in. Was I supposed to clean up after him too? I had been so caught up in listing rules regarding the entities, I hadn't thought of basic rules for living with a housemate. By the time he'd thrown his bags unceremoniously onto the guest room floor and plopped himself on the bed, I had reduced my rules to a single rule in hopes he would follow it. "All right, listen, Brian," I started. He was flipping through his phone. "You can't wander around the house at night." That seemed to catch him by surprise, enough that he looked up from his phone. "Why not, cuz? You doing something naughty around the house at night?" he said, waggling an eyebrow. "No, it's... This is where I realized I hadn't thought of how I would word that the house was haunted to him. Just that I like to keep it quiet around here. "Don't worry, I'll be quiet," he said, looking back at his phone. "I'm serious, Brian. No wandering around at night." Yeah, all right." I shook my head and went down to make dinner. We survived dinner without speaking to each other. He just looked at his phone the whole time. Then after dinner, he plonked himself on my couch and turned on the TV. Then he noticed my game console and turned that on and started playing a fighting game. "You mind maybe asking before using my things?" Yeah, he said, absently mashing buttons. It was just past 6 and the sun was setting. "Man, I'm serious about the night thing. You better finish that up before the sun sets. And please, wash your own dishes." "Uh-huh." Rolling my eyes, I went to the pantry to grab my usual nighttime snack rations. Upon seeing my stashes of chips, biscuits, and instant noodles, I grabbed some spare shopping bags and hauled the lot up to my room. No way I was going to let Brian eat all those while I was asleep. It was 11 at night when a flurry of knocks came on my bedroom door. I opened the door to find Brian standing outside, white as a sheet. "Dude, I saw a ghost. Your house is haunted, man." I kept checking over his shoulder. What did it look like? "I don't know, man. I turned around and there was like a little girl in the kitchen. She was all dark. Then I just booked it up here, man." "Hair color? Height?" "What? I don't know. Black, I think. About yay high," he said, putting a hand to just below his chest. Okay, not the mirror demon. It was the basement thing. "Yeah, look, just stay in your room like I said. The black dust by your door keeps you safe." He hesitated. He was still pretty pale and checking the stairs. "For real? Like, what if I need to use the bathroom?" He had a point. I took out my dustpan and broom and swept the iron filings from his door. Then I placed them in a line near the top of the stairs. "There, that gives us the upstairs. Don't break the line." He nodded and shakily went to his room and shut the door. I heard the click of a lock and I went back to mine. The incident seemed to have humbled him a little bit. He was a lot more polite and placated me for the next few days. Although there was still no offer of rent or grocery money, he stayed in his room all night, sleeping, I suspected. He'd come down for dinner, the only meal I decided I was willing to cook for two, then disappeared back to his room. I had work to attend to, and I didn't pay him a lot of mind. This arrangement only lasted a few days, though. One night he came rapping on my door again. It was almost 12, and I was just about to go to bed. I opened up grumpily. He had the most ridiculous smile on his face. "Yeah?" "Dude, ghost girl. She's trying to tell us something." "What?" "I've been trying to catch her on camera, man. I've been going down there at night to film her. Then she looks like she's gonna get close, and I run upstairs." "The hell is wrong with you?" I half shouted. "Dude, come on, it's a real ghost. This stuff's like viral as hell. We could be famous. You want to see my video? I got a really good one tonight. She appeared in the kitchen and walked all the way to the laundry room. It was so scary I followed her, but man, look at this footage." No, this is not okay. "But this is where it gets good, man. Some guy on the forum did some stuff with the footage, made it brighter and some stuff, and you can make out, that she points at things." My brain was so torn between intrigue and rage that I couldn't respond. On the nights I've seen her, she walks like somewhere random and points at a piece of furniture. Sometimes it's a couch. Twice it's been that bookshelf in the living room. Once it was under the kitchen sink. Then she just disappears. I think she wants us to find something, man. Brian, I've had like so many posts about this thing, bruh. Brian, what? That thing is not friendly. Stop this. I don't know what it wants you to see, but it's dangerous. Come on, man, you chicken? You still a baby, Mr. I can afford a house? That was a reference to me being the youngest cousin on my mother's side. I was always referred to as the baby. It implied that I was a spoiled brat, so it seemed to really annoy some of them. I'd been able to afford a house at such an early age, earlier than most of them. Yeah, I can afford a house, and you're not posting videos of my house online. I don't care how many likes you're getting. Stop it, now. Whatever, man, screw you, he said, and stalked off to his room. It was icy between us for the next week. Well, icier than it had already been, I guess. He still came down, expecting dinner at 5, and started taking his plate up to his room. Then he would dump it discreetly in the sink and try to wash it. He obviously never did housework, but perhaps what I wondered about most was how long it had been since he washed his clothes. I never really saw him do laundry. It had been almost 2 weeks since he arrived. I figured it was the end of whatever commitment of kindness I owed any family member, and was preparing myself for the confrontation when I asked him to leave. So, on Saturday, I'd messaged my mom that I was going to talk to Brian and have him leave by the following week. I put my phone on silent and braced for the storm of texts and calls that would surely follow that message. But my mind was set. The next day at dinner, I was going to have a serious talk with him. I got a message from my friend Vivian, close to midnight, that said, "Is this your house?" Attached to it was a link. I clicked the link that led to a live feed, and it was indeed my house. Brian was filming right that moment. I was livid and was just about to get out of bed, throw open the bedroom door, and crash his party, when I heard his voice on the feed. "All right, guys, the temperature's dropping. She's coming, boys," Brian whispered. I kept watching. He was filming from the bottom of the stairs, and you could make out my kitchen furniture in the faint light. Then there was a long silence. I couldn't see it, but after a minute or two, Brian's phone started tracking something. The screen was so dark it was impossible to say what. As whatever it was came closer, Brian ascended a few steps up as if ready to make a break for it. But the thing, which was still hidden in the shadows, continued past the stairs into the living room. Then, for the briefest of moments, I caught sight of some odd humanoid shape silhouetted against the dimly lit window. It didn't look like a girl. It looked like a child-sized, soot-black snowman with what may or may not have been an arm sticking out of its side. Then it lost itself in the gloom. The camera tracked it a little bit longer, then stopped, pointing more or less to my front door. It held there for about 10 seconds. Then I heard Brian's voice come back. "You see that? Yeah, I think she's pointing at that shoe cupboard." There was a pause where I assumed he was reading some messages on an app. Yeah, I think she's gone for the night. Temperature's climbing back up. But I've known her to come back twice in a night, guys. I'll want to check that shoe cupboard out. I just don't want to get caught with her blocking my exit, in case I can't get upstairs. Yeah, lights are a good idea. She disappears when I flick the lights on bright. The feed glared a bright orange-white as the living room light came on. As the views returned to normal, Brian announced, "Okay, boys, we're doing this. Let's hope she stays away." The camera bounced its way to the shoe cupboard. "All right, no sign of her. I think we're good. Let's see what's up with this cupboard. Just a bunch of shoes. Don't see anything strange here, guys. Let's check out Brian moved his phone to check behind the shoe cupboard. There was a square hole roughly a couple of feet wide on each side in the wall behind the cupboard. "Guys!" Brian's voice came out excitedly. "What is this?" The video went haywire as I heard Brian moving the cupboard out of the way. Then it focused on the hole. Brian appeared to be crouched and trying to see into it. Its walls were made of naked concrete, and it just stretched away, the light of the torch seeing no end. I don't understand. The wall was one of the house's outer walls. It couldn't even be 3 feet thick. Was it the outside they were looking at? No, you could see the wall of the corridor go on at least 5 feet past the phone light. "Think I should go in?" Brian asked. "Yeah, okay. YOLO. Man, it's narrow in here." The screen got black with sudden flashes of Brian's hands as he started to crawl into the space. That's when I decided I needed to intervene. A shadow child had just shown him a passageway that defied the laws of physics, and his audience thought crawling into it was a good idea. Maybe they all thought this was some elaborate prank, some ARG that would promote a movie or something. Maybe this was some sort of alternate reality anyway. How the hell did that passage even exist? I don't remember a hole there when I moved in. Surely I would have seen it when I put the cupboard there. I hurried out of bed, went out onto the landing area, and reached the top of the stairs. I brought myself to a sudden halt there. The downstairs was pitch black now. Hadn't Brian turned on the living room light? The hackles on the back of my neck prickled as I felt the air drifting up from below, chilly as though from an open fridge. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw it. A patch of black against black, standing at the kitchen entrance, peeking at me from around the corner. I think it waved at me. Sorry, but I'm not that fond of Brian. I backed into my room and closed the door. The feed was still going, but with a steady interference now. The images flashed by like a jaunty slideshow, and Brian's voice came through in short barks. "There's a dead body in here! Oh, crap!" The screen showed a gray, dusty mound on a rough concrete floor. It might have been a body. "This is..." Static. "Oh!" The video quality reduced further into a snapshot that came through every 5 seconds. An image suddenly came through of a figure sitting by a table, its hands resting on it. The figure was skeletal, and its jet black surface gleamed like someone had decided to carve the grotesque thing out of obsidian. In fact, the only reason I didn't think it was a statue was the fine, long hair sticking out of its skull. Then the feed froze completely, a blurry capture of the black reflective hand against the gray table and an open book. There was writing on the open page, but the image was far too unfocused to tell what it had said. Was it a list, maybe? I panicked. What was I supposed to do? Did I call the police? Did I try to go downstairs? I paced my room back and forth. I stared back at the feed again and again, but it stayed frozen on those hands. I almost called V, but I didn't. Finally, I decided to go back to the staircase and see if the basement thing was still guarding it. I opened my door, and I could tell the living room light was back on. I hurried across the landing, but even before I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a commotion from the living room. It was Brian, covered in dust and scrambling to pick himself up. He was hooting in laughter and crying at the same time. I glanced back warily towards the dark kitchen, but it was empty. Then to the wall where the hole should have been. It wasn't there anymore, though. I strode across the living room and felt the wall. It was solid brick. I rapped on it a few times to be sure. What the hell? I turned back to Brian, who was now making his way up the stairs. "Hey, you want to tell me what the hell just happened?" He ignored me and started to clamber up. I followed him, still wanting to yell at him, but decided it was better to do so behind the safety of the iron filings. He got to his room and sat shaking on his bed. I stopped at the door and stared at him with my fists clenched. "I was watching your feed. What happened to the passage? It was beyond the shoe cupboard, right? You were watching? Did you think he meant what he said? What are you talking about? The guy behind the wall, sitting at the table. Do you think he meant it? Brian was suddenly standing and shouting. I paused suddenly, taken aback by Brian's sudden shift in demeanor. Sorry, I didn't hear what he said. He sat back down on the bed, nursing his forehead with one hand. Let me see your phone. What? Your phone, Brian demanded, still looking down, voice rising once more. No, I said, folding my arms. He moved a lot faster than I thought he could. Before I knew it, he had lunged at me, knocking me out of the door frame and pinning me against the opposite wall. Give me your damn phone, he said, through gritted teeth. I wasn't able to break free, but my sense of anger and pride would not let me give in. No, I spat out. I don't think he realized I had my phone in my robe pocket, or he probably would have just grabbed it. He looked like he wanted to punch me when the lights downstairs flickered and went out. Brian's gaze shifted immediately to the stairwell beside us. He let go of me and turned back to his room. Hey, I said, coughing. The door was closing, but I threw it back open. I was so angry, the threat of the stairwell, now full of inky blackness, didn't even enter my mind. You're not welcome here anymore. Get out. If you're still here tomorrow morning, I'm calling the police. I don't care what your mother says. Then I stomped back to my room and locked the door. I pulled out my phone. Brian's feed was still running, but it was no longer the hand on the book. It was just black. He must have left it in the passage that didn't exist anymore. Something came through on the audio, though. A screech from a far, far away place. Finally, after 15 minutes, the feed completely lost connection. Morning came. I was lying in bed, refusing to get up, even though it was 9 and I'm usually up by 7, as the night's events hadn't given me much sleep. There was a knock on the door. I sighed and opened it a fraction of an inch. Look, dude, I need to stay here, okay? I shook my head. No, not okay. You're moving out today. I don't care if you have to live out of your car. Get out of my house. Brian looked disheveled. You don't understand, man. I understand perfectly. You've been messing with the entities in my house when I expressly told you not to. Then you decided it was okay to shove me against a wall. Screw you. Get out of my house. I need to get back in there, okay? I shook my head. Get out of my house. I'm calling the police if you're not out by lunch. And if I have to, I'm putting a restraining order on you. He looked like he was going to explode, but instead he just stormed back to his room. I could hear him beginning to throw stuff into his bag. Not even 20 minutes later, I heard his car engine roar and the wheels skidded out of the driveway. I sighed in relief and went to clean up my house. There was still dust and debris all over the living room, and Brian's room was unsurprisingly a pigsty. My mother did message me, telling me to put up with Brian, and I took some relish telling her that Brian had already moved out. Then I ignored her following texts and phone calls for the next couple of days. The mystery of the disappearing passageway irked me. I went online, seeing if I could find any of the videos Brian had uploaded, but it looked like he had deleted all of them, and I couldn't track any of the forums where people might have left responses. I didn't try very hard before I decided to just let the matter be. Perhaps I should have been more uncomfortable with the idea of a ghost girl or the basement thing in my house that had pointed at the furniture with a disappearing passage behind it. But I'd been living in the house for a year, and strange things just came with it. I left them alone, and they left me alone. Apparently, though, that hadn't been Brian's motto. It was the third morning after he left that I found Brian, blinded and unable to speak, blood pouring out of the ragged orifices of his face, thrashing around in my kitchen. When he couldn't find me via groping around, he managed to find the kitchen stool and threw it at where he guessed I was. I ducked as it whooshed over me. Then he went into a mad rampage, grabbing anything he could feel and throwing it around. I was too horrified to even tell him to stop. I just ran to my room and called emergency services. I was shuddering and thinking about the wails and moans I heard from downstairs while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. The aftermath was as hectic as you could have imagined. I'll try to tell you it as cohesively as I can remember. After emergency services collected Brian, my house was investigated as a potential crime scene and cleared when, other than Brian flinging things around, there was no sign of violence. No one ever gave me any notion of when, where, or who had mutilated Brian. Of course, the police questioned me. I told them the truth as much as I could without sounding insane. Brian and I had a falling out. He'd been living here for 2 weeks. I woke up and found him having broken and entered my house and in that condition. They came back to question me again the next day at the motel I was staying at while my house was being investigated. They didn't find anything as far as I could tell, and I haven't heard from them since. My aunt tried to contact me incessantly. I blocked her number, but then she showed up at my house. I didn't let her in the house. She was obviously distressed, and at least she wasn't speaking at me with her accusatory tone at this point. I told her I was sorry, but I didn't know what had happened to Brian. It was true. I really didn't know what had happened to Brian. When she left, though, I later heard from my mother that she fully blamed me for Brian's sorry state. My mother held me responsible, too. I told her that they could all go to hell. I guess Brian was already there, somewhat. I don't know what happened to Brian. I never went to visit him, and I'm unlikely to meet him anytime soon. As much of a miserable specimen of humanity as he might be, I would never have wished this fate upon him. I hope he'll find some sort of way to go on living, find some sort of peace in the perpetual darkness that he now lives in. Before I left, and as the police bustled in and out, I had noticed the cupboard beneath the sink was open. There were pools of blood in there that didn't look like they had been flicked from Brian's frantic motion. Was that where the passage had taken him? What had he seen in those passages this time? What had the black figure shown him or said to him? I still don't know. But soon, I'd have to walk those narrow passages myself and make a deal with the person who waited with the open book within my wall. I've counted them as the fourth entity in my house. There's just one to tell you about then. The emergency alert on my phone went off with a shrill noise, repeating 3 times and vibrating angrily, just as I was bringing the last of my stuff into the cabin. I took the device out of my pocket and stared at it in disbelief for about a minute before realizing that I'd have to leave, only moments after arriving. My hands were shaking from the cold as I read through it again. Severe weather alert. Heavy snowfall in the Frontenac region is expected to begin tomorrow. 60 to 80 centimeters of precipitation. Not good. I realized the roads would be impassable by this time, the following day. That meant I would have to leave early the next morning to avoid being stuck on the road in the blizzard, but subsequently meant 0 ice fishing time for me. I'd be lucky to make it home before it started coming down in earnest. Moments later, messages started coming in from my 3 friends who had planned to join me. The group chat notification popped up on my phone as I opened it. Matt, did you see the emergency alert about the storm? I guess the trip's off. What a bunch of crap. Ted, OMFG, a generational storm is what they're calling it now. Looks like we'll have to postpone it a few weeks. I hope you didn't go through with your plan to go up a day early, Jay. Greg, no kidding. What are the chances this blizzard hits on our ice fishing weekend? I messaged back saying I understood we'd have to reschedule. I told them that I made the trip up alone, accompanying the message with forehead slapping emojis. It sucks that I'll be stuck up here alone, I thought to myself. My dog Gibson pawed at my leg, and I smiled at her, feeling slightly reassured by her presence. Yeah, you're right, Gibby. I'm not completely alone. At least I've got you here with me. After putting down a bowl of water and another containing kibble, my next priority was to start a fire in the small brick stove at the center of the main living area. There was wood stacked up in a neat pile next to it, and a small bag containing kindling which we'd brought with us in the summer and left behind. At first glance, it looked like a large enough stack, but I knew from experience I'd need twice as much as it appeared to make to get through the night, so I went outside to gather more from beneath the boathouse. The family cottage was a rustic one, to put it mildly. There's no running water, no electricity, and the cabin's poorly insulated. Perennially procrastinated repairs were needed in more than one place, including the floor beneath one bed which had partially collapsed, letting in slight trickles of cold air from outside. It was drafty, and I could hear the sound of mice which had made their way through the gaps, burrowing in the bedroom and finding their way into our old coats or sleeping bags or something that we'd left behind. I sighed as I lit the kerosene lamps which were scattered on wobbly tables around the main living area. There was something about having vermin in the cottage that set me on edge, but at least Gibson's presence would keep them at a distance. After filling the place with warm, flickering light from a half-dozen kerosene lamps, I felt a little better. There was reassurance in having fire, and I started working on making a big one in the stove that would keep me warm throughout the night. I loosely wadded up some newspaper and then stacked dry kindling on top, making a teepee. Over that, I added larger pieces of wood, until I had piled it to the ceiling of the small stove. Then I lit a strip of cardboard and held it up to the paper inside, catching it alight in several places, watching as it began to burn and then flared up in a bright white-orange glow. Holding my hands up to the fire, I watched it and warmed myself up. Eventually I took off my boots and my coat, the entire cottage getting a little toasty. There's no sense unpacking, I thought, taking a beer out of the cooler and opening it. I took a sip and couldn't help but grimace at the taste. I'd never tried the brand before, and I picked it up on recommendation. It was awful, and lukewarm to boot. Par for the course, considering the trip so far. Took out my phone and watched some Netflix while beer went flat beside me. I lifted Gibson up onto the futon with me so that she was off the floor and close to the fire where it was warm. Eventually I got bored of Office reruns and called it a night, adding another log to the fire and reminding myself to wake up in an hour to keep it going. Pulling the futon even closer to the stove so that it was close to the fire as safety would allow, I curled up in my sleeping bag and drifted off into an uncomfortable slumber, constantly tossing and turning, trying to stay warm but not really succeeding. I woke up to the sound of whining coming from Gibson's trembling form on the bed beside me. I was so cold that I was actually scared. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and I realized a few hours had passed. The fire had gone out completely, reduced to mere embers at the base of the stove. I put on my jacket and blew hot breath onto my fingers, pulling Gibson closer to me. She was shaking as well. My hands were trembling as I put more newspaper and kindling on the fire, blowing it into embers and hoping they would reignite. My lungs felt frozen, and my heart was beating fast, my skin prickling with pins and needles, turning it into a total numbness in my extremities. I'd never felt so cold in my life. I realized I was far beyond the weather forecast for tomorrow. It seemed like it was minus 30 degrees, and steadily dropping further. Terrified that I wouldn't be able to get my body temperature back up, my mind started racing, thinking of worst-case scenarios. If I couldn't stop shaking pretty soon, it would be impossible to start the fire again. I recalled that my truck was just outside, and I could get in there and start it up, turning on the heat until I felt warm again. The idea of getting out there and the truck refusing to start was too much to take, though. Considering the state of the beat-up old Ford, that seemed like a distinct possibility. So I continued stoking the fire, blowing on the precious few embers and adding more newspaper every so often until the tiny flame had begun to grow. I held my shaking hands up to the measly fire and added pieces of kindling sparingly, one by one, terrified of it going out again. Pulling Gibson closer, we shared each other's warmth, and I began to feel halfway human again. A sound came from outside the cabin suddenly, startling me and causing me to jump. My heart skipped a beat, then pounded faster and faster in my chest. A noise like fingernails being dragged along the siding could be heard from all around, echoing in the small space, Something was going from one end of the cottage to the other, attempting to get inside. Deep, guttural breathing could be heard, grunting and snorting, desperate as it scraped its talons along the boarded-up windows. Gibson began to whine, making high-pitched noises as she huddled closer to me, and I put my hands over her muzzle, muffling her sound. Was it a bear, I wondered? I realized I was holding my breath. I thought about the holes in the flimsy facade of the cabin, the spot beneath the bed where mice were getting in. I thought about the broken screen door and the wooden one behind that, which needed to be replaced, almost falling off its rusty hinges. The entire cottage felt so frail and insecure all of a sudden, and I heard the loud noise of whatever that thing was, breathing heavily just outside, trying to get in. Maybe it was too cold out there even for it. The ground shook from the weight of the creature as it made its way around the cabin. I was so focused on it that I didn't notice the fire going out at first as it fizzled down to embers. I continued holding my breath until it was gone. Then I relit the fire, my shaking hands barely able to get it going again. Once it was burning hot, I didn't sleep anymore. I pulled Gibson close, and the two of us stayed up all night, watching the fire with wary eyes, taking occasional glances at the door. Even once we were both warm, we continued to shiver. When the sun came up, I didn't notice at first. It was dark in the cottage one minute, and then it was light. I blinked my eyes a few times and rolled out of bed, deciding I would waste no more time leaving. I was hoping the bear, or whatever had been outside the night before, was gone. Gibson was scratching at the front door, asking to be let outside to pee, which told me it was probably safe. In the light of the morning, all that had happened seemed to be a bad nightmare, and I told myself maybe it had been, till I got outside and saw the claw marks that marked the exterior wall. Shuddering, I threw my belongings in the truck, doused the fire with too much water, and took one last look at the place. What a weekend this had turned out to be, I thought to myself. With more people around, it would be easier to keep the fire going, taking turns feeding it with wood so that everyone could sleep through the night. But it was frightening being up here by myself, even with Gibson by my side. I'd never done it before in the winter, and I never would again. There were too many things that could go wrong. Freak snowstorm, a fallen tree blocking the road, getting stuck or going into a ditch, and those were just the beginning. I wanted to get out of here before any of those things happened. The truck didn't want to start at first. I turned the key in the ignition twice, hearing only the click of the absence of any engine noise. Cursing loudly, I checked to make sure I hadn't left the interior lights on or something which would drain the battery. Satisfied there was still a charge, I tried one more time, and finally the old shitbox let out a cough and kicked into life. The engine began to sputter before finally settling into a steady, rusted purr. "All right, Gibson, let's get out of here," I said, rubbing my dog's head and smiling as she blinked at me. She looked content in the front seat, happy to be back in the truck and out of the cold cottage. There was a thin layer of snow on the gravel road, and the tires moved easily enough. I looked up to see the sky was turning gray above us. A few snowflakes were just beginning to fall. The weather was making an early appearance. I turned on the radio, and sure enough, they said the same thing I was thinking. The storm would be arriving early. By noon, the highways would be a parking lot. Whiteout conditions. Be prepared to be trapped in your car. Have emergency services ready. My anxiety was through the roof as I went around a bend in the road. Hitting the gas, I came to the first big hill and went over it, seeing something strange up ahead as I came over the rise. Whatever it was blocking the road. Massive, brown. The lumpy fur shape got bigger as I pulled up in front of it. The bear, which had been trying to get into my cottage the night before, was dead, lying in the middle of the gravel road and blocking it completely. First, I thought it had frozen to death. I got out of my truck and inspected it and was surprised to find there was a horrible smell coming from the carcass. It was a chemical smell, noxious and unpleasant, like some sort of factory waste. The snow had melted all around the beast, the blood and entrails pooling around the far side. What the hell could have done something like this? Aren't bears at the top of the food chain? Alpha predators? Gibson was by my side, but she didn't venture anywhere near the body. Usually she would have gotten curious, trying to sniff at it or something like that, but she stayed next to me, emitting a low growl. The road was completely blocked, I realized. There was no way out, not unless I could move it. No matter which way I attempted it, the giant body of the dead bear would not budge. It weighed a ton. There were large trees on either side of the road, so close to the driving path. There was only one way out, which was by driving across the frozen lake. And that was way risky. I hadn't been able to test the thickness of the ice yet. It would need to be nearly a foot deep for me to feel comfortable, but there was a clear way on and off the ice if it came down to it. I got back in the truck and threw it in reverse since there was nowhere to turn around. I felt sick to my stomach, nervous with anticipation and fear, uncertain of how things were going to play out. Once back in front of the cottage, I got out of the truck and went down to the ice with my spud. Walking out onto the lake, I cleared a spot with my boot and began to dig. I dug with the sharpened metal rod. Satisfied that I'd found the bottom of the ice, I put the tape measure through the hole, hoping it would be close to a foot. Looking at the tape measure, my heart sank. The ice was barely 7 inches thick, just below the minimum 8 inches where it would be safe to drive a vehicle across. My truck was on the heavy side, and I wouldn't feel comfortable unless it was a full foot thick. I pulled out my phone and checked for a signal, deciding it was time to call someone for help. Who would I call? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't get out of this jam by myself. Of course, I muttered out loud, seeing the signal bars were down to 0, and the words "no service" were printed over the top of the screen. Surely I would have gotten another severe warning alert otherwise, because snow was now being dumped down on me from above, and the sky had turned nearly black with the approaching storm. I typed out a message in the group chat, telling them my situation, hitting send regardless of the lack of signal. I knew from experience that it would go through eventually. I just hoped it would be sooner rather than later. Gibson let out a loud, high-pitched whine, her tone rising in volume as she began to bark. High, persistent yips that were totally unlike her. She backed away, then let out a stream of urine, her hind legs trembling as she did. I looked up from my phone and saw what she had spotted. Across the lake, something was moving in the trees. I saw fingers wrapping around a tree trunk, too high up, the nails too long and too sharp to be a person. Whatever this giant was, it looked similar to a man, but it was massive. It peered out at me from beneath the boughs of the trees, its head probably 15 feet off the ground. Its skeletal limbs matched the monochromatic tone of the birches on either side of it, a gray, pale white shade. I couldn't distinguish the entire form of it in the shadows, but I could make out its eyes. They reflected back at me, catching the gray light coming through the clouds. And then I saw its mouth spread wider in a grin, teeth dripping blood, and it disappeared back into the darkness. The temperature felt like it had dropped to 30 below again, and I began to shiver involuntarily as I looked down to see Gibson doing the same. There was only one choice, only one place we could go. Back to the cabin. It was either that or risk plunging the truck into the frozen lake, attempting to drive across. We were on a small peninsula surrounded by water on all sides. Only one way in and one way out, and that way was blocked by the body of a giant brown bear. I took the dog back inside the cottage and locked the doors, taking uneasy glances outside through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. What the hell was that thing in the forest, I asked myself over and over again, but no answers came to mind. There were no creatures I could think of that were 15 feet tall, with reflective eyes that stood on 2 legs like a man, capable of disemboweling a full-grown brown bear, capable of causing the temperature to plunge all around me. There was only one creature capable of that, and it wasn't supposed to exist. It was something from myth, from folklore, from legends that weren't supposed to be real. "It's a Wendigo," I said out loud, immediately regretting the words, as if saying them made them true, as if saying them would summon it. Wendigos are supernatural creatures born of Canadian First Nation folklore. They live in cold, remote places and make people go mad merely through their presence. They thrive on hunger, despair, and loneliness of their victims, who usually live in remote communities. They drive families apart, instilling urges of cannibalism in people and making them want to consume their loved ones. During the lean, hard months of the winter, this usually happens. They turn people into raving cannibals, driving away all their loved ones, and then once they're alone, the Wendigo strikes. It either consumes you while you're still alive, tearing flesh from your bones while you beg and scream, or it turns you into one of its own kind. But the Wendigo's greatest curse is that no matter how much flesh it consumes, it only grows hungrier. With every ounce of meat it takes in, it grows taller and more emaciated. Its hunger grows more insatiable with its height, until it's a towering beast with its head amongst the treetops as it roams the forest, constantly searching for its next meal. Gibson whimpered and burrowed her face into my armpit as if hearing my inner thoughts. Trying to reassure her, I stroked her fur and told her it'd be okay, although I had a feeling it wouldn't. I tried to get the fire going again, but it was a fruitless effort. Everything inside the stove was damp and wet, and scolded myself for dousing the fire with so much water. Still, I kept at it, knowing we might be stuck here for a while. Pretty soon the wind was howling and blowing outside, and the snow was piling up in front of the door. I made a point of opening it every so often to clear the snow from the steps, knowing that I would need firewood, taking weary glances off into the forest across the lake as I did so. Finally, I got the fire started, a low guttering flame in the stove, which wanted to go out all the time. Everything was damp, but I kept feeding it fresh kindling, nursing it, until it was able to keep going by itself. Hours passed as we waited to either run out of firewood or be attacked by the creature. We were running low on kindling and the sun was beginning to set. My stomach rumbled with hunger when I felt something strange. The ground suddenly shook beneath my feet, and I heard Gibson whining from beside me. "What is it, girl?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat as I realized the answer. It was the creature. It was back. The dining room table began to rattle and bounce up and down as whatever was outside got closer, and I imagined the creature lifting the roof off a cabin like a top on a dish in a fancy restaurant, picking me up and eating me whole like a wriggling shrimp. A second later, there was a sound at the front door, metal being ripped and sheared as I realized the creature was making its way in. The screen door landed on the ground with a crash, and then the wooden door was being torn from its hinges an instant later. Cold air rushed inside as Gibson began to let out shrill, panicked barks of terror. I heard the thing tearing apart the front entrance, easily ripping apart the wood and making the doorway larger so that it could come inside. I tipped over the dining room table to use as a barricade. I picked up a chair, the only weapon I could find nearby, thinking I could throw it at the thing's face to defend us, when I heard a strange noise from the front. It was a car horn honking. Someone had come to save me. I heard a loud ding and pulled out my phone and saw the green check mark beside my group chat, indicating that at some point it had gone through, at some brief moment when there'd been a gap in the clouds. Reading the new messages brought a hopeful smile across my face. "Matt, you just had to skip town a day early and go ice fishing, didn't you?" "What the hell is that thing?" Ted was yelling from outside. "I don't know, but it's trying to get inside. Jay, are you there?" I shouted back that I was. There was a loud screech from outside, which I realized had come from the monster. They'd actually wounded it somehow. I ran to the front door with Gibson and looked out, seeing the creature for the first time. It stood with its back to us, its head among the treetops, even taller than it appeared at first. My friends had caught it off guard, but now it was fully aware of them, and it was going after them. The Wendigo was distracted by something in front of the cottage, and I realized that one of my friends had gotten out of the car and they were using themselves as bait so that I could flee the cottage safely. They had driven across the ice with their lighter vehicle, just as I had hoped to do. I guessed that they'd run into trouble moving the body of the giant bear which blocked the road. "Jay!" Ted screamed out the window, driving the car in a circle on the ice, as if too terrified to stay still. I raced over to the car, slipping and sliding on the ice. It was Matt who was distracting the Wendigo, I realized, and I called for him to get away from the thing. It was too large, too fast. He didn't know what he was dealing with, but that was Matt. He was always act first and think later kind of guy. Not only that, but he often put himself in harm's way for his friends. He turned to look at me and gave a thumbs up, his attention diverted from the creature for a split second. As Gibson and I got into the car, we heard his scream. I looked up to see the Wendigo, close the distance in an instant, and was picking him up like an insect, turning him over and beginning to bite him. As Matt screamed for help, the creature peeled off his skin, exposed his skull as it ate his face. The calls for help turned to bubbling gurgles and wet, choking sounds, and I nearly got out of the car to run after him, but Ted grabbed my wrist and pulled me back inside. "You can't save him," he said with wet-rimmed eyes, and eventually I relented. We raced our way across the icy lake, making a path through the blizzard, cutting a swath off the fresh-fallen snow on our way back to mainland. For a while, we debated what to do. Should we call the police? Our friend had just died, after all, but we knew that if we did, we'd be considered suspects. And with no other reasonable explanation, they'd pin his death on us. They'd say we'd killed him. There were no boxes they could check on an official police report citing a Wendigo attack. So, since such things didn't exist, being myths and legends, we'd be their only suspect. As it turned out, we didn't have to worry about it, though. A message popped up from Matt on the group chat just a few minutes after we got home, and I had to tell myself that it wasn't all just a nightmare, a hallucination from the cold and lack of sleep and food. But Ted and Greg both told me I hadn't imagined it. What we saw was real, as much as I wish it wasn't. The three of us read the message on the group chat again and again. My heart was beating fast, and a sick knot was growing in my stomach, bile rising in my throat that I could taste inside my mouth. "Hey guys, you really missed out on a feast. Ice fishing is just as much fun in a blizzard, if not more so. Let's reschedule the trip for next week, okay? I'll be waiting for you here." As much as we didn't want to go, we've resolved that we have to. We can't leave Matt like that. We have to help him. Next week, we're making the trip back up there, even if it kills us. All I ever wanted was for my wife and I to live comfortably, but the longer we stayed together, the higher our bills became. We'd already fought off debt from college, barely scraping by. Even after we paid them off, we were only able to afford a tiny apartment on the outskirts of New York. Sidewalks laid cracked everywhere, while finely condemned buildings sat sadly against their crooked foundations. Crooked lampposts that hang only by electrical wires. Graffiti marked every street corner, and bland art that existed without rhyme or reason. Homeless people could be found on every street corner, a constant reminder of what would happen to my wife and I if I failed to keep up with our payments. However, I managed to make somewhat decent money as a plumber, but even then, it sometimes wasn't enough to deal with the loan sharks, the hefty utility bills, the food prices, and gas money. I was willing to do anything to get us out of there. And that is where I encountered gambling. I was willing to take the risk. I'd take any chance to obtain a reward, even just a small one. It started out with a handful of poker games. Then I moved on to scratch tickets and slot machines. All I needed was enough to get by. Unfortunately, obtaining a payday from the casinos was impossible. I started growing desperate, which only led to more debt. The whole cycle sucked me down like Odysseus' ship into Charybdis' maw. Just like that, my relationship with my wife began to tear apart. My wife and I were once so close. Before we married, there would be days that we'd work together at the wood shop, creating 3D prints of various sci-fi characters in video games. Other times we'd study the components of circuits and use them to create elaborate lighting displays whenever Christmas arrived. Our wedding day was supposed to be the greatest day of our lives. Instead of relying on the help of others, like we did back in college, we relied on ourselves. But my actions tore all that apart. I didn't know what else to do either. A few nights ago, I arrived at my apartment, having completed a 10-hour shift fixing drains of several upper-class tenements. I rested my hand on the knob, expecting the worst from my wife. Sighing, I pushed the door open. The moment I did, she was already in the front hall. Her eyes were scrunched, and she was holding a bank statement, smacking it for emphasis. "Care to explain?" she demanded. I rubbed my temples, removing my scum-covered overalls and plopping them right into the nearest laundry hamper. We locked eyes. Breaking eye contact with her would only ignite her anger further. She was holding another piece of evidence of my failure to strike it rich. All I could do was stand there sheepishly, tail tucked behind me, and wait to get ripped a new one. No words would come out of my mouth. She marched up to me, holding it in my face. "Frank, you wasted $3,000 at the casino again, didn't you?" my wife bellowed. I set my toolbox down and washed the pipe gunk off my hands, looking down for just a bit. "Turn around and look me in the eye." Resting a hand on my eyes, I glanced over her petite frame. Then I began to speak. "We can live comfortably if you just give—" "Enough of your excuses. We nearly lost our apartment twice from all the betting on the slots. You wasted our heating money on roulette. And now this. The landlord wants $4,000 in 2 weeks. And if we can't get it sorted out, we're going to lose our apartment." I held up my hand reassuringly. "Look, just let me figure this out. I'll think of some way to get money. You better, otherwise we're getting a divorce. You got it?" Without another word, I put on a casual outfit and exited for some fresh air, shutting the door behind me. I gazed back at the unpolished apartment number on the frame. Wincing, I clenched a fist and descended the rickety stairs. Eventually my boots hit the cracked pavement and I headed off. I stood outside a graffiti-covered subway station, pacing around, hands in my pockets. My fists constricted as I pounded a nearby wall. There's no way I could have been able to make that kind of money. Craps were too unpredictable, arcade machines were always rigged, and roulette was too high in stakes. Seeing red, I screamed and kicked a wall as hard as I could. My foot throbbed, and once I was done with my fit, I broke down sobbing. The sidewalk darkened with my tears. I pressed my head against it, clawing at it until my fingernails turned crimson. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder. Wiping my tears away, I glanced over. A card was lying on the floor. Its borders were covered in green dollar symbols. The rest of the card was a silver color, shiny enough to reflect my face in it. Written in gold letters were the following: Aces High Casino. Win 1 round of blackjack and earn $50 million. No monetary wager needed. Table 777. My eyes lit up. All I had to do was win 1 game of blackjack and I'd be rich. Dimples formed at the corners of my cheeks and I pumped my fist. I nearly clicked my heels in joy, but I decided against it. I'd already caused enough of a scene already, and I wanted to make sure nobody knew my secret. When I flipped it around, it had an address also written in gold letters. Despite the address being in an unknown area, I still managed to pull it up on my phone's maps and arrive without much struggle. The casino itself was a pigsty, to say the least. Smokers polluted the air and the prison-gray interior. Slot machines with broken lights clicked and whirred while cheap dice clattered against tables with peeling felt. Meanwhile, the concrete floor was covered in colonies of roaches while neglected beer bottles sat against the rugs of several tables. The only thing that was well kept, was the bar, and a room draped with navy blue curtains and gold sashes. Emblazoned over the doorway was the number 777. This was the first time I'd entered a casino smiling. For once, I thought this was my lucky night. When I pushed the curtain away, they revealed a room with an ornamented black wallpaper, an assortment of oak desks, and other furniture. The walls were covered in fine Baroque paintings. On the floor was a single blue carpet covered in opulent tapestries. I followed the back wall to a single dealer table coated in green felt. 2 seats were present, with one person taking the seat on the left. He was shaking with what I assumed then was excitement. Behind him was a dealer, a trim man with blonde hair and a top hat over his nose and eyes. He wore a dapper tuxedo free of blemishes that shimmered in the light of a single hanging gas lamp. His skin was pure, free of moles, glistening with a slight amount of glitter. "Why, hello there," the man spoke, his voice slicker than the gel in his hair. "Are you here to win big?" Unlike the loan sharks, his teeth were cleaner than a freshly washed plate. "Yup, deal me in," I said, straightening my back, shuffling into the last seat. The other player had his jaw locked together. His eyes were drooping and bloodshot. Sweat pooled around his brow like glass beads. Just like him, I always felt nervous about losing, so their reactions were understandable. "You know the rules of blackjack. I deal out cards. You say hit me if you want more cards. Get closest to 21 without going over. Dealer only draws 2 cards, and you can also surrender your cards for half your bet. When you don't want any more cards, say the word stand," the dealer said, shuffling his cards through his hands and manipulating them like a sculptor with a ceramic pot. I double blinked. "Wager? What do I bet with?" "Play a game, and I'll tell you." The mystery man focused on passing out the cards. First, he brought out 2 cards for himself and dealt 2 more to each player. Instantly, he flipped over his cards. Jack King, 20. I clutched the velvet black card, seeing what I was dealt. A 10 and a 7 of hearts. I forced my face into a neutral smile. My stomach twisted. There was no way I could get 21 that easily. "Surrender," I said, pushing my cards to the dealer. All he did was shuffle the cards and toss me 2 more. They didn't even bother looking up at me during the process. The other players started clutching his stomach. His smile vanished. I carefully looked over the guy's cards. 7 and a 2 of clubs. "Hit me," the guy on the left choked out. An ace of spades. Total of 10. Sweat trickled down his head like a shower in April. His eyes welled up with tears, while foam developed in the corners of his mouth. I raised an eyebrow, wondering what his deal was. I knew the stakes of gambling, but my sixth sense was telling me something was just not right here. No, that couldn't be true. Even if there was some kind of string attached or fine print I didn't read, I couldn't risk giving up on that kind of money. Besides, this might have been my only chance to obtain such a vast reward without much risk. "Hit me," the man wheezed. 5 of hearts. His teeth chattered. While I waited for my turn, I stood up and walked around the room, getting a closer look at all the ornate gadgets and such. My eyes focused on a painting on the leftmost wall. It resembled a man in a rich military regalia, but something made my hair stand on end. His upturned white mustache looked damp, and his face sagged like they were crying. Linear, stick-like shadows were cast on the sleeves. Edging forward, they came into focus. Hands. I followed their form outward, which extended into oily, dripping arms. "Shh!" A faint noise echoed from somewhere in the room. "What?" I mouthed, turning an ear to the source. "Shh!" It came from the painting. I backed away, hands at my side. Was someone dragged into that painting? "Where are you going? You forgot to pay up," the dealer yelled back, hands slamming on the table. and pulling out a sack of navy blue poker chips. I double-took. I thought the card said that no monetary wager was needed. There isn't. Then I looked at the ground. There was a second rug on the ground. The tapestry matched, but its pattern didn't match with the other rug. It was off-center from the rest of the decorations, like someone didn't even bother setting it up properly. Taking a closer look, I could hear faint whispers coming from it too. When I looked back up, the guy on the left was gone. I rushed over, checking his cards. A total of 25. Swallowing saliva, I stood in confusion, wondering what to do next. I scraped my fingernails against my palm. I needed that money. If I didn't get it, I'd lose my wife and my apartment. And what about loan sharks? Only God knew what would happen to me if I didn't pay up. What was I going to do? What would happen if I lost? Would I turn into another object, just like the other guy? Or would it be a worse fate than that? That's because there isn't a monetary wager. I'm still taking half of what you owe. In my game, your payment is in pain. A sharp stab punched my left side. It felt heavier than before, like my veins were replaced with tungsten. I grabbed my fingers around my chest. The area around the pain almost felt like a tumor. Brushing around the area, I could make out a cylindrical mass. I tried to inspect it some more, but the pain overwhelmed me, and I crumpled to the ground. I crouched down on all fours, trying to get back to my seat, but the pain froze me in place. Reaching out a hand, I called out for help, but I got nothing. Slithering away, I pulled back the curtain to the entrance of the casino. I spat on the ground from the bludgeoning pain. Don't feel out of luck? You can still surrender once more and have 2 chances left, the dealer smiled, adjusting his hat. It was only a glimpse, but I caught a look at his upper face. His eyes were on his hat, and his forehead was blank. The dealer looked plucked straight out of an Alice in Wonderland book. What or who was this guy? Think long and hard about it. I saw you arguing with your wife. I clambered back to my seat. I still didn't know what the dealer did to me. Something in me forced me to get back up and keep playing. More questions ate at me the longer I played. How did he know that information? Then I remembered feeling a tap on the back at Grand Central Station. The card that brought me here. He couldn't have been human. Was he some kind of demon? I didn't bother asking. There wasn't any way he would spill the beans about his nature anyway. After what seemed like hours, I managed to writhe back to my seat, slumping over the table like I'd just had the worst hangover. Ready to try again? The charming man said, resting his chin on his interlocking hands. Reluctantly, I gave him a thumbs up. He took back the cards and began manipulating the deck again. I analyzed every move he made. None of the cards were tricked. He wasn't second dealing, and he didn't have any aces up his sleeve. Never revealing anything under the table either. His honesty was the only thing that brought me any reassurance. Still, keeping an eye out was critical. The dealer revealed his cards. 2 tens again, 1 of spades and 1 of hearts. His face was harder than diamonds and glowing like one too. Not a pleasing glow, but one that vexed anyone that dared to glare at it. I looked at my cards, an ace and a 7, 18. Gripping my lower abdomen, I stayed crumpled in agony. The odds of getting a blackjack were slim, and stabbing pain skewed my thoughts. Surrender, I wheezed. The words slipped out of my mouth like a dying breath of a wounded soldier. The dealer smiled, holding a pile of blue poker chips around him. He waved his hand over the mound and made it an audible chant. Then they vanished. I held my hands over my face, bracing myself. Suddenly the pain doubled, shifting to my right like a mudslide down a hill. Now I knew everything the previous player was going through. I vomited out something hard and blue. It was a poker chip. Suddenly my guts turned and another 7 spilled out. My esophagus wound itself into knots, more contorted than cobwebs. "I forfeit." The man started to smile. "Without these?" With a thud, the hat-faced dealer pulled out a jar filled with a kidney and a piece of liver. They still oozed with blood that pumped and fit their containers. I remembered how the dealer said that there was no monetary wager. He never said there wasn't a wager at all, though. I paid in pain, and my wager was my organs. "You want them back? Then win them." He set them back on the ground. Now there was no choice. My fate was sealed if I tried to leave. I started to shed tears. If I didn't get those organs back and fast, I was done for. Even if someone saw me passed out on the floor, finding donors for organs wasn't guaranteed. And even then, it had just put me further in debt. Nothing would be solved. Then again, was trying to beat this guy even worth it? No, the reward was too great. Taking a deep breath, I sat back down. Reluctantly, I asked that he proceed. The dealer drew out cards like before. He took the cards and gave them a good shuffle. Plucking 2 cards out of the stack, he revealed them. A king and a 9. Another poker chip tumbled up my throat. I spat it out, red and blue plastic heaping together. Not paying attention to the mess I made, he handed me 2 cards. A jack and a 2. A 12. "Hit me." An ace. An ace could count as 1 or 11, depending on what other cards were drawn. Still had a fighting chance. "Hit me." A 5. His dead stare tore at my soul. I scratched against the felt, the wounds on my finger reopening. From the corner of my eye, I could see him frowning. "Are you going to play, or do you want all that money to go to waste?" "Shut up," I said through gritted teeth. "Hit me." I watched the dealer play out the last card. A queen. "You lose," the dealer said coldly, grabbing a pile of poker chips and holding them close. He waved his hands over the mound and made another incantation. Then they vanished once more. Everywhere at once, burning pain seared my skin, making me black out. When I woke up, felt my arms, they were covered in something hard and blue and plastic. The clothes were gone. I examined my extremities and my torso. My skin was missing, replaced with poker chips. They were shaped to fit every part. Cracks filled with blood gushed out with every slight movement I made. Horrified, I spilled my guts. More poker chips slid out of my throat. Piles of skin laid clumped to the side of the table in hideous pink and blood-red sheets. "I think you know what's at stake now. 1 try left. You better make it count, unless you want to end up as an object for all eternity." The rigidity of my plastic-coated skin made every movement expose more and more cracks, searing my muscles. I groaned as I raised myself up. Crimson liquid dampened the table. I pounded at it. This was it. I either walked out of here with my money and saved my marriage, or I lost and suffered a fate worse than death. Giving up was not an option. I gave the mysterious man a death glare, not even bothered by his resistance. He plucked out 2 cards, a 9 and a 10. This was my chance. Then my cards were revealed, a 10 and a 2. Fingers rattling, I took a deep breath and let the calmness seep into me. "Hit me," I sputtered. Another 2. Huffing, I opened my mouth to speak again. The dealer just stared at me, tilting his head like a vulture waiting for roadkill. The poker chips rattled again, grinding against each other. "Hit." I paused for a moment, collecting my thoughts. At a value of 14, I needed at least a 6 to beat the dealer, but an 8 or higher would result in disaster. Gulping down another chaser of saliva, I spoke. "Hit me." To my chagrin, a 5 slipped out of the hand. I was now tied. Staring at the pile of skin and my other organs, I closed my eyes, and shook in horror. An ace or a 2 were the only cards I could draw in order to win. I looked down at my cards, sweat dripping on the table. With a quick glance, I gazed at the eyes on the man's silk hat. "Don't keep me waiting," the man demanded. I'd begun to hyperventilate. His stare grew more intense the longer I waited. His confident smile turned into a frown of irritation. Eyebrows and mouth were twisted into a hideous snarl. He rattled his fingers against the dealer's table. The cacophony made my ears go numb. Then I whispered, "Hit me." The man darted up, smiling back in anticipation. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. "Hit me!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. Then, the last card was revealed. A 2. I had won. My mouth dropped open. The sheet of skin unfurled themselves and flattened over me. 2 organ jars spilled over, their contents rising in a beam of white and torpedoing back into my body. Immediately, I yelped at the top of my lungs, clicking my heels and doing a little jig. I regained my strength, instantly looking around for traces of my prize. For several minutes, I wasn't able to uncover anything. Staring directly at the dealer's face, I asked him to reveal the prize. "I don't have it with me," he said blankly. Not listening, I scrutinized every inch of the room, looking beyond his station, checking under the table, everywhere. I searched everywhere for my prize, my happiness dissipating. With each step I took, my smile faded even further, twisting into a frown. My nose crinkled. "Where's my 50 mil?" I demanded, overturning the table, ripping off the ornate paintings and yanking the tasseled rugs off the floor. "You promised me 50 mil if I beat you. Do you realize what's going to happen to me if I don't get that money, you charlatan?" The strange man just stood there, not even acknowledging my plea. "You promised me money. You're a thief," I roared, pointing an accusing finger at him. "I only did this for my wife, to save my marriage. I almost gave up my life trying to help my family out. You can't take that away from me." The demon stuck his hands behind his back and shook his head. He rolled his eyes back in thought. Something was up with him. "You aren't like the other gamblers," he said. "What other gamblers?" I said, looking back. "They all wanted the money for worthless things. A mansion with fountains and a view, hookers, a trip to Tahiti." He paced around me, his face rather relaxed and calm. Never once did he lose eye contact with me. "But you had such determination to help your family that you would risk everything. I admire that. It took me a while, but I figured out that you're actually a kind-hearted person." I saw red and tried to punch him. He grabbed my wrist, shoving it back. "Listen to me. I understand your rage. There never was a prize in the first place. It was nothing but a lure to capture those that wasted their lives away. But there's one thing you don't understand." I thrust my hand back. "I understand you nearly killed me for nothing." "Yes, but that was before I saw you the way you really were. Listen to my words." Slowly I relaxed my posture, but I remained firm. "Why should I listen to you?" "I can help you out of your situation." "You owe me money, you snake," I said, my nostrils flaring. "You never needed the money in the first place." Taken aback, I retreated. "What do you mean?" I said. My arms relaxed once more. "You're a plumber, aren't you? I saw you come home from work. I also caught a look at your schedule. 40 hours a week for $38 an hour for 5 days a week. That's $36,000 a week for 2 weeks. You already have everything you need." "But you don't understand. They need 4,000, I pleaded. He wouldn't budge. "Trying to earn this money via dumb risks and chance will not get you anything. Look at all the things you've done wrong." "And I want to change that," I said, wiping my eyes as they began to tear. "But what am I supposed to do now?" "The only way you can earn that money is through grit and spit," he said, walking around me. "You aren't going to find solace through good luck alone. and you already have the tools that some people don't. If you give up now, you might as well have lost. Think about it." With those last words, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers, disappearing without a trace. Slowly, I gathered my things and walked out of the casino, head hanging low. The next day, I was fixing an old lady's faucet, inspecting the leak. I wondered what the demon's words had meant. Before I stuck the wrench up to the U-trap, I remembered my pay. If I worked the same amount of hours as before, I'd only make $3,600. But if I pulled off some overtime and worked several extra hours, I might just be able to pay off the debt. I started staying up much later than before. Not long after, my wife started becoming suspicious. Eventually, she confronted me. "Frank, you've been staying up late. You going back to the casinos again?" she asked, hands on her hips. I closed my eyes, and instead of fear, calmness filled my veins, and my blood stilled. "Not this time. I've been putting in some overtime." Her face loosened up for just a moment, before hardening again. I held my hands up and motioned my palms downward. "Listen, I've been horrible lately. All my gambling did was drown us deeper in debt." Her expression began to soften up again, her frown vanishing. "I want to change things. We used to work so well together, doing everything to help each other. Instead of fighting against each other, it's time we made our peace, and we bring us out of debt together." I held my hand out for her to shake. She kept her arm pulled back and folded like a pincer of a mantis. Inch by inch, though, she extended it and took my hand. The following day, my wife convinced me to go to therapy and get out of my addiction, which I gladly obliged. Simultaneously, she decided to start up another job working as an electrician. Day by day passed, and we pooled our resources as one. Before our eyes, bills were paid, and debt disappeared faster than our eye floaters. Our financial status wasn't the only thing that changed. Her once crusty mood lightened up, and she began to smile more. She began to believe my words and began to respect the changes I made. And then we paid off our rent. We got a letter from our landlord saying that we now were even. The moment that letter came in, we embraced each other. The only question now was, what were we going to do with the extra money? Not long ago, we ended up earning enough to create our own 3D project, this time of a companion cube. Day after day, we create more projects. Although we weren't as happy as our days back in college, we still could make the best of what we had. In retrospect, the hat-faced man put up a good fight, but I managed to come out of the casino with more than I'd gone in with. It wasn't exactly money, but it wasn't worthless either. Now, I have seen some stuff as a kid growing up in the projects. Drug deals gone wrong in front of my elementary school, a drunk and high hobo trying to break into my middle school to stab each and every one of us, with a banana, we later found out, and my fair share of gang violence during my high school freshman years. But none of these, and many others I haven't mentioned, even come close to the stuff I've seen at this one friggin' private school I went to for 6 years. And no, I wasn't there for that long because I got held back. I just received my undergrad diploma, and I've thought a lot about this messed up stuff that defies any kind of explanation that I've seen at my old high school. Things so unbelievable it only makes sense to post them here and not anywhere else. So, you ready? Good, because this won't be a smooth ride. Not by a long shot. Now, these stories aren't chronological by any means. I'll only be writing what's, clearest to me. Sometimes it's from my senior year or my second junior year. It all just kind of depends. For now, though, I'll start with my earliest memories. Sophomore year. The year I transferred to William Harrison's preparatory school for gifted youngsters. Due to the aforementioned incidents I've talked about, and all the others that I didn't, my mom had started to look into alternative schools for me right around the March of my freshman year. God knows how my heart dropped when she admitted that she'd worked her ass off for at least 3 jobs to pay the admission fee for the scholarship test. Surprisingly, I passed it with flying colors. We had a huge blowout party with all my relatives, and later my old childhood friend threw me another party where we all drank ourselves into oblivion. Needless to say, I was looking forward to the future. Man, if only I'd known how much and how fast things would go downhill, I never would have taken that damn test. But hindsight is always a bitch. I remember the exact moment I knew the place was bad news. September, first day of school. I'd been feeling nervous about all the other rich kids seeing me in my mom's old car, but that feeling disappeared real quick when I laid eyes on the place. To say it scared the crap out of me would have been an understatement. It was a brooding structure that seemed like a wave ready to engulf, and although its architecture preceded its reputation, it felt less safe than any school I'd ever been to. It was a sunny day, but the shadow that building cast over me made the air so cold it felt like winter. My mom, on the other hand, didn't seem to feel anything amiss, so she drove off after a friendly wave, and I went through those doors, my brown paper bag grasped firmly by my slightly trembling hand. I felt like a lost castaway as I traveled through those long hallways. I knew which class I had to go to, but I just couldn't find it for the life of me. The place was like a maze, and never before had I ever felt so out of my depth. At one point, I got so frustrated that I just sat down on a stairwell that I'd happened to stumble on. It was on this very stairwell, feeling quite dejected, that a certain someone called out to me. "Hey, you okay, man?" I turned and found myself face to face with this guy who was wearing the same uniform as me. He had this kind of grin, and his round cheeks softly topped the ends of his smile. I felt at ease for the first time since I'd entered the place, and I struck up a conversation with him. His name was Derek, and he seemed like a really cool guy. I explained my situation to him, and he laughed it off, offering to take me to my class himself. We made some small talk, and he also seemed like a real down-to-earth guy. I had been worried this school would just surround me with these rich, spoiled white kids, but meeting Derek felt like a breath of fresh air. We got to my class, and I had to uncomfortably part ways with him. He was a senior, which to younger me explained his coolness in an instant, but he said that he would catch up during break with me. With that, he disappeared behind one of the corridors, and I walked into my class. I was robbed of the relief that Derek had gave me pretty much the moment I stepped in there. The lesson, which had been going on, grinded to a staggering halt, and everyone, and I do mean everyone, the teacher included, turned to look at me. Countless blue eyes stared me down as I sheepishly took my seat, trying my best to be as small as possible. The lesson resumed as sharply as it had stopped, and all I could do was take notes, having gone from the most visible guy to the most invisible. I tried to talk to the others in the coming days, but they all just seemed odd. They were nice and welcoming, but I could sense a certain hollowness in them that gave me the heebie-jeebies. They also seemed to struggle in class, even though the material was pretty easy, and I often found myself wondering if there really was anything under those blonde tops of theirs. As you can imagine, I often ate my paper bag lunch all alone. People around me would be chattering and laughing away, and I'd just sit there chewing my sandwich in silence, wondering about whether my mind found relevance in that moment at all. But on one of those days, about a week after I'd started, I was eating my sandwich alone, as always, when all of a sudden Derek sat down in front of me. I recognized his voice in an instant, but when I looked up at him, I froze when I saw the huge bruise just above his eye and the white patch that covered his left cheek. "Dude, what the hell happened to you?" I asked. Derek only smiled. He talked about being neck-deep in his studies for midterm exams and only now had the free time to come down and visit me. Although I was worried, I appreciated his company, so I didn't bring it up, how he'd completely ignored my question. Several days passed, and I spent each and every one of them talking to Derek during lunch. He was someone who just got cooler by the moment, and although he wasn't the most literate when it came to pop culture or current events, we still found a lot of common ground with each other. He admitted to me that he wasn't the most popular guy in his grade, which I just couldn't bring myself to believe, but he assured me that it was fine. But from what I could see, it wasn't just the student body that treated Derek poorly. The teachers also seemed to be going along with it. I remember bumping into Mr. Knight one day, the senior history teacher, and casually asked him about Derek, remembering that he was a huge history buff. But the guy just looked at me for a moment, a visible, almost faint look of confusion in his eyes, before walking off without saying anything. William Harrison's preparatory school for gifted youngsters sure was a hell of a place, and not in a good way. This was how most of my days went. Going to school, taking notes, talking to Derek during lunch, the highlight of my day, taking more notes, going home, finishing any leftover assignments, sleep, and then repeat. About 4 weeks in is when it happened. I was in a particularly boring class, my eyelids struggling to stay open, let alone letting my eyes see what was in front of me. The teacher's voice seemed to drone on forever, and the last thing I remember before falling asleep was wondering just how the hell anybody else looked so damn focused on a guy that made you feel more bored listening to whatever he was saying than watching grass grow right in front of your face. I awoke with a jump a few moments after things went dark. The reason for this? Well, the fire alarm was blaring like there was no tomorrow, and the spinning white blindness was like needles being shot through my eyes. Its screeching grated my eardrums to shreds. I looked around hurriedly, and that's when I noticed the first thing that made me feel uneasy about the whole thing. No one but me was in the class. I was the only one present. In fact, it looked like no one had ever been there. The blackboard, the ancient as hell thing, was as clean as a whistle, and it also lacked several large blemishes I'd noticed before. In fact, everything seemed to have lost its sanding from age and exuded a pristine glow. I would have probably sat there frozen like a deer in headlights forever, had the smell of smoke not invaded my nose. Just one whiff was enough to send my ass into a fit of coughing that I barely managed to get under control by pressing my mouth against my jacket. I knew I had to get out quick, the fire being the least of my concerns. I grabbed the door handle with my naked skin and fought back the urge to cry as my flesh sizzled while I turned the knob. The pain brought a new wave of adrenaline that made me even more awake than before. Everything was on fire. The hallway, the paintings, the trophy case. The flames clung to the wall as though they were made of dried and aged wood instead of concrete and steel. The fire had seethed its way into every crevice, and the ceiling above was covered in a cloud of black fumes, the air itself burning my eyeballs. I ran from the corridor to the next one, wondering if I was making the right turns, but it wasn't very long before I found myself in a part I didn't recognize at all. The flames hissed and gnawed like whips, eager to sink their smoldering teeth into me. My strength was running out, the adrenaline rush wearing off like a high, and I felt like I was out of options. Well, until someone called out to me. I turned my head as naturally as one could and found myself facing a sight that no one had ever prepared me for. Derek stood not 6 feet away from me, his entire body a burning wick, and yet he didn't so much as twitch a muscle. "You gotta get out of here," he said, his voice somewhat raspy as it burned his vocal cords. "Yeah," I told him, my brain struggling to process the situation. "The school's burning, so we gotta—" "That's not what I meant." The voice cut the air like a bullet, and I forgot how to talk. "You gotta get out of here before it's too late, and believe me when I say that it's better to be consumed by fire than consumed by this place." The last thing I remember is reaching out to Derek, his skin a blackened mess that was one step away from soot by this point. But even with 10 fingers on one hand, I still couldn't manage to grab a hold of him before everything went dark again. I awoke with a jump, and everyone turned to look at me. I looked around the classroom and breathed in a sigh of relief, everything being as it should. There was no way to describe the relief I felt when I counted only 5 digits on my hand, but there's also no way to describe the exhilarating pain I felt with no warning. I turned my other hand, the one I'd been counting with, and stared at the terrible blister that was forming on my palm. my red, sagging skin already encapsulating in a bubble of liquid held together by the thin membrane. Oh, Derek! How I wish I'd listened to him. Knowing what I know now as I'm writing this, if I could go back to that day that you warned me about, as I sat all scared in class for no apparent reason, I'd have gotten my ass out of there before the bell would have rung and never come back. But since I'm writing this, you know I didn't. And trust me when I say that this was the least interesting thing I'm going to write about in this little report. William Harrison's preparatory school for gifted youngsters was a big school. A very big school. A very, very big and ginormous school. Yeah, that sounds better. If I had to compare it to anything, it would probably be Hogwarts. If Hogwarts, of course, were located in America and funded not by goblins, but by the social elites who sold their soul to the devil. That place really was the love child of Gothic and neoclassical architecture. Its 4 towers, like those of a mosque, reaching far up to the sky and looming over it. The only other thing I suppose you could look at and get the same vibe would be a tsunami. Excluding the main building, which had all the things you'd expect from a school, cafeteria, gymnasium, classroom, etc., you also had several dormitories nearby, which were basically low-key high-rise apartment complexes. Besides those, there were also several full-size stadiums for various sports, which, as far as I'm concerned, were more suited for pro athletes than a bunch of lazy high school kids. Don't even get me started on the horse stables. With all that in mind, I'm sure you get the idea of just how big this place was. And one day, during my first senior year, as I was eating my lunch alone as always, I remember wondering out loud, without having swallowed my sandwich, mind you, "Man, who cleans this place?" I'd already been a student here for about 2 years, and I'd seen some stuff that really should have decommissioned the place for good, ranging from health hazards, death, and property damage that should have only really been caused by dynamite. But I can assure you that whatever the hell destroyed the school's observatory sure wasn't dynamite. And yet, the very next day after any incident, at most 2 for the really severe ones, like the observatory, students would be allowed to come back to school, and everything would be just like it had been before. Everything from the students who died to the buildings that had been damn near evaporated would be back as if nothing had ever happened. Not to mention messes that would have given body cleaning experts nausea would be taken care of, easy peasy. I asked one of the teachers who was in charge of maintaining the school, assuming that the principal just, had a lot of contracts with cleaners and contractors. But that teacher, as well as every other person I asked, said there was only a single individual who kept the school, the whole school clean, and in tip-top shape. Mr. Enoch. Now, obviously, I thought they were messing with me, because there was no way any one man could clean a place as massive as William Harrison Preparatory School for gifted youngsters, consistently and, most of all, regularly. But the more I thought about it, the less crazy it seemed. With all the other things I'd seen over the years, could one guy cleaning a really damn big place really be that far-fetched? After ghosts, demons, dimensional travel, serial killers, that one succubus, and everything else, would one guy cleaning a big place really be where I'd draw the line? It was around March 24th, to be exact. To say that I had nothing better to do on that unassuming Wednesday would be an understatement. With the map Mrs. Scott had given me back during sophomore year, I had no trouble finding the janitor's closet. But I did frown when I saw that it was located at the very edge of the map. At the very edge of the school grounds, in fact. When lunch rolled around, I followed the map, making my way through the eerily empty grounds, until the small dot on the map that represented me reached the spot labeled Janitor's Closet. I looked around, but saw nothing. Even when gazing at the furthest end of the threshold of the wood from my left to my right, my scar that I got during junior year from those damn elves aching as I did so, I saw nothing. The map showed that I was right above the janitor's closet, and I don't know if it was intuition or experience, maybe both, but I looked down and stared real hard at the grass. That's when I noticed it. A hatch. A metallic, rusty, grass-covered hatch. My next period after lunch was a free one, so I think you, dear reader, will have no trouble guessing what I did next. Part of me felt relieved that it was far away from the main building, as the moan that the thing let out as I lifted it open could have burst eardrums unless you were out of sight. The other part of me, the small, rational, sane part that had somehow survived after so long and after everything, protested vehemently, but I still went down there anyway. My phone's flashlight revealed a long, winding stairway that traveled deep below the earth, so deeply, in fact, that a dark fog that my light couldn't quite vanish hid the end. The derelict stairway creaked every time I shifted my weight a step further down, the sound amplified by the stagnant silence that hung everywhere in the air around me. I had no idea what to expect. At one point, I checked my map and saw that the layout had changed. The stained maroon interior had become a cool charcoal gray, but instead of showing the outline of my school and all the other buildings, it showed me long and winding tunnels. Think of a subway map, covered by spilled noodles. That, in effect, was what I was seeing. I continued on, and the stairway eventually devolved into a ladder. Upon reaching the bottom, I was greeted by 6 lonely tunnels, each holding aloft signs written in a language that could never come naturally to any human. Devil runes, as I had unfortunately come to learn from Isaac's writing. Squinting at my map, I was barely able to make out my destination, but once I found Janitor's room, a faint path illuminated. I followed it through one of the tunnels and made my way through the unwinding path, one infinitely more perplexed than any sewer system, a system that could have very easily belonged to Hire, that underground part of the school dormitories which inspired Lovecraftian cities of Rylea. After a while, through good or bad luck, either as likely culpable as the other, I happened upon the door I'd been looking for all along. It looked so out of place that it actually fit. Plastered on that stained and weathered accented concrete was a quaint and antiquated wooden door, baby blue when it came to color and decidedly Victorian when it came to style. I could have done any number of things at that moment, but there was only one which came to mind and seemed appropriate given the circumstances. I knocked 3 times, waiting for the door to open. I heard a latch being unlocked, and the man I'd been searching for all this time peered out. "Hello?" A raspy voice, almost throwing up dust, spoke out, and I was somewhat taken aback by the figure who soon revealed itself to me. A tall, lanky, fairly disheveled old man stood beyond the threshold of the door and looked at me without a shred of animosity or annoyance. His eyes were weathered but kind, and the small badge that hung from his uniform read Mr. Enoch. Of the two of us, I'm sure he was warier of me than I was of him, but even so, the old janitor didn't hesitate for a moment in letting me in, after expressing my desire to enter. His room was, for lack of a better description, a windowless jail cell. The cellar reached high up, like we were at the bottom of a fat well, and although spacious, I was also greeted by a bed, a table, a sofa, and countless books written by none other than Professor Francis himself. A single chair had been set up in front of the sofa, as though he'd been expecting me. The old man wobbled towards the sofa, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He looked like he'd have a hard time holding a mop, let alone using it, and even more so to clean a place like William Harrison Preparatory School for gifted youngsters. After we'd seated ourselves, an uncomfortable silence took hold. I had no idea where to start, and Mr. Enoch seemed to be going through the very same problem. I myself became so focused on finding something to talk about that I was caught off guard when he said something. Are there any more trees left beyond the ones here? I stared at him, confused by what he was trying to get out of me. Thankfully, he understood my confusion and elaborated further. When I was younger, I read a science fiction story about how in the far future there would be no more trees, only concrete and metal. I haven't been out for a while, so has that happened yet? No, I told him bluntly, at least not yet. His mild grimace softened into a smile at my wit. After that, Mr. Enoch mostly asked questions about the outside world, and we had a nice chat. I feel somewhat guilty for not being able to precisely recall what it was that we talked about at the time, since I'm writing this now. I do remember, however, that after some time had passed, Mr. Enoch suddenly lifted his sleeve and stared at his vintage wristwatch that clung to his waning wrist. I apologize, but I'm afraid we have to cut our conversation short, he said quite suddenly. I looked at the time on my phone and saw that the school day was almost over. Mr. Enoch was nice enough to show me out, and for once, I wish I could have stayed longer at school. Talking to Mr. Enoch became a daily routine. I like to think that it was therapeutic for both of us. In our subsequent interactions, I'd mostly asked him about his past. From what he told me, Mr. Enoch had been the janitor for the school since the mid-1930s, and he'd gotten the job to support his family during the Great Depression. The money he earned was the only thing that kept them afloat. Even after the Depression passed, he continued to work at the school as a janitor, eventually moving in to live here. It was the only thing he was qualified to do, and the cash was better than almost any other job that he had had. He had seen strange things, he told me, much like I had, and there were other janitors who'd help him out, but after so long, he was the only one who'd stayed. Made it, was how he put it, and I couldn't help but understand. Anyway, as he got older, he found it increasingly difficult to do his job. It also certainly didn't help that he had to do everything alone by this point. He felt like Sisyphus, he told me, each day struggling and pushing against a boulder that put him at the threshold of his strength limits, only for it to roll back down again. When the 2008 economic crisis hit, he knew he'd be offed. For the first time, there were many people willing to take his job, and that, coupled with him losing his house, made him terrified of ending up on the street and in a world that he hadn't been in for decades. In short, he was willing to do anything to keep his position. Anything? The principal asked. Anything, I replied, and thanked him, and now I have this job forever. He wouldn't elaborate any further on that. By the end of April, I'd told him all about the things I'd experienced, and he seemed saddened by what he called the 1,000-yard ramble, where I'd explained everything in great detail, but gave the impression I wasn't talking to anyone in particular, like talking to a wall. Never made much sense to me back then, but I went along with it. Interesting, isn't it? Mr. Enoch once told me after finishing a long sip of tea. You'd think you'd have this whole place figured out by now. After all, that's what you've gone through, but there's still so much more, ain't there? You'll be gone soon enough, and the next fresh fish, one with a heart like yours, will still be able to see this much and much and much more. That honestly scares me more than anything. If everything I've gone through is just a drop in the bucket, then I don't ever want to think about the ocean floor and what it could possibly hold. These were the kinds of conversations we had. They really lifted a weight off my shoulders, you know? Made me feel like a human and made me feel understood. Corny, I know, but what the hell, am I right? On some occasions, though, I'd find his presence unbearable. I saw myself in him. I saw where I never left this place. But then I'd wonder if it would be so bad. Scouts, Wendy's, Derek's, and others like me would always continue to come here. And with my experience, maybe I could save them. But Mr. Enoch's gaze would always curdle whatever I'd be thinking like that at the time, as if he knew what my mind was toiling at, before telling me not to think too much, for fear would rot my brain. Too much thinking is bad, he always tells me, and maybe there's a benefit to being ignorant to it all. Maybe if I'd been ignorant, the past would never haunt me. I think it was around late April when I decided to die. I didn't know how, just that it would happen before graduation. Something would come my way, and I wouldn't run like a coward. That's all I knew. The next few days were all a haze. Exams were on the horizon, but what the hell did I care? The days started to compress together like pancakes, each day blurring into the next. Things had been peaceful. My mind didn't really like peaceful. As far as my mind was concerned, something was wrong. In essence, I found myself trapped in the coils of a reality that I wanted to desperately escape from. I wasn't going to attempt to take my life. I was merely waiting for it to end. Just like that, all the other things in life came to me when I least expected. On one day in particular, May the 9th, on Thursday, when my mom would be working until early the next morning, and I was supposed to return by bus, I dozed off after my last class, and by the time I woke up, only moonlight shone through the windows. This wasn't the first time I'd been in the place after dark, far from it, but this was the first time that I was here past midnight. The monolithic saying inscribed last in Adam's Last Testament I'd found with Mrs. Scott that time in junior year reverberated in my skull, as though I was just reading it for the first time all over again. Abandon hope, all ye who last past midnight. And I felt that this was it. It would be waiting outside the classroom, the thing that would finally give me the peace I wanted, the peace that I deserved. The light of the moon oozed through the sealed window, stretching my shadow thin like the sun. My mind was counting every second, my ears ignorant to each step I took, even though I myself was not aware of it. I walked down the long, ever-winding, ever-changing hallways, led not by Mrs. Scout's map, but by my shadow, the bowsprit that led me forward. Eventually, my shadow clashed against the shadows of something else, two ships colliding with each other. I'd finally met them, the one who I knew would give me the peace I wanted. I looked up, 30 seconds till midnight. What are you doing here? I admit that despite him being that old, hearing Mr. Enoch's voice tremble as much as it did was something that caught me off guard. You're always alone, I'd told him. 22 seconds till midnight. Even now I can feel them, like a metronome bashing the inside of my skull. It's a terrible feeling. Believe me, others have always come to my aid, but it's about time I return the favor. 12 seconds till midnight. No, was all my friend could say before he collapsed to the ground. 10 seconds till midnight. Mr. Enoch writhed as though he was the rope in a tug-of-war between a seizure and an orgasm. You don't understand. It's not too late. Get out of here. I can't hold it. These and many others are the words I thought Mr. Enoch would have told me, were he not in the middle of his midnight metamorphosis, the one I'd sensed. With every tick, his bones cracked, his flesh seared and squirmed, his mind fragmented. But not once between any of them did he let out a scream. Midnight finally fell like a curtain. One last tick, And it came. Hundreds of leeches seemed to erupt out of the poor old janitor, each the size of a horsefly, gushing forth towards me like a Yellowstone geyser. 40 yards became 30, 30 became 20, 20 became 10. The wave approached like a slithering snake, and one could outrun it if they were fast enough, and if they started running before the thing picked up steam. But I stood still. It was only when the wave was about to cross the 5-yard threshold that someone tugged my arm with unprecedented strength. I found myself running, the avalanche behind me picking up pace like a snowball, rolling down from Everest's summit. Mrs. Scout? I wasn't being pulled. Rather, I was chasing the past. I could hear her steps, muffled as they were by the ear-caressing squelching sound that followed me. I lost track of her, but when I noticed a wave of ashen hair disappear behind a corner, I followed it. Desperately, I wanted to catch up with Wendy, to apologize. The more I ran, the more I felt like I was chasing darkness, something that I'd always carried in my shadow, but never been able to reach. I found myself surrounded by lockers. The wave was approaching from both sides, and I knew that it wanted to sink its countless vile teeth into me and leave nothing behind. I closed my eyes and felt the strongest grip yet yank me to my feet and shove me into a locker. The door slammed, and through the cracks, I saw Derek, his face contorted into one of rigid grimness. "We're fine with being stuck here," he said, "but not with you joining us." He ran in the direction I had, and a large looming shadow left me in darkness. The countless, ever-sprawling maggots didn't dare invade the privacy of the locker. They seemed to shriek like a crowd jeering because I had gotten away. It was so dark, I only remember waking up. Mr. Enoch had opened the locker and held me tightly, glad to see I was alive. "You see that?" he said, barely able to contain the first genuine emotion he'd felt in a long time. "You're not alone, and you never will be. Not here, not outside either." I took a bus home in awe and shock. The whole ride, I just tried my best to focus my attention on the blooming sunrise. I found my mother asleep. She'd collapsed on the couch the moment she'd returned, which, I guess, worked in my favor. Not that long has passed since then. Story's over. I get it's odd, especially after my last one. First comes the beginning, then I give you an end of sorts. This isn't like me. I bet you'd be disappointed with the pessimistic tone I've written this in. You don't know anything, though, do you? So many things I haven't elaborated on. Hell, things I haven't even mentioned yet, but which I will, in time. The lid of Pandora's box has been opened. Thanks to you, Mr. Enoch. I'll tell someone else's story next time. Those who were consumed before they had a chance to do so themselves. God knows that's the only reason I'm still alive and kicking anyway. All thanks to you.